She was just a small-town waitress, quiet and steady, wearing the same weathered turquoise necklace every day. One morning, a wealthy outsider mocked it in front of everyone. Junk store trash, she laughed, betting it wasn't worth a nickel. But that cruel moment set off a chain of whispers, curiosity, and truth she'd never imagined. When experts finally arrived, the room fell silent as history surfaced and lives shifted. How could one forgotten heirloom hold millions, and a legacy worth far more than money? And what happens when dignity, long overlooked, finally takes its rightful place? Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The morning hum inside Ellie's diner began the way it always did. The low hiss of the grill, the clatter of plates being stacked, the faint chime when someone came to the glass door and let in the cool autumn air. Outside, Main Street was just starting to wake, headlights sliding across cracked pavement, trucks heading toward the mill at the edge of town. Inside, the smell of bacon and coffee had already settled deep into the linoleum and the vinyl booths. It was the kind of place where you didn't have to check the time to know how far into the day you were. The rhythm of boots and spoons kept its own clock. At the far end of the counter, Mara Lane moved with quiet, practiced steps. She'd been on her feet since 5, the pre-dawn shift that belonged to truckers, farmers, and the men who ran the scrapyard. She wore her usual faded blue work shirt with the sleeves rolled to her elbows, a pocket stuffed with order pads and pens. Her dark hair was tied back loosely, and a stray wisp brushed her cheek every time she leaned over to refill coffee cups. Around her neck, tucked against her skin but catching the light whenever she bent or turned, hung a small, uneven pendant strung on a chain that had dulled with years of wear. It wasn't pretty in the way jewelry in glossy catalogs is pretty. No sparkling stones, no polished gold. Just a silver oval frame by curling turquoise inlay. One side rubbed smooth where a thumb might have rested hundreds of times. Nobody ever asked about it. Or maybe nobody had dared. In a small town, questions could travel faster than answers, and Mara didn't invite that. She wore the necklace like people wear old scars, visible but private. Once, months back, a college kid passing through it said, "Cool retro vibe," and she'd smile politely without explaining anything. After that, the necklace returned invisibility, accepted as part of Mara herself, like the faint white burn mark on her wrist from a long-ago kitchen accident or the deep calm she carried even on the busiest mornings. She moved between booths with the lightness of someone who knew every squeak in the floor and every customer's habit. Frank Daly always sat near the window with his newspaper folded tight and would grunt for black coffee before saying anything else. The old men from a VFW shared the round table near the pie case, trading quiet jokes while nursing eggs and toast. 2 teenage girls whispered over pancakes, phone screens glowing between them. Mara knew their names, their favorite orders, the quiet aches in their stories. A father who hadn't come home, a mother juggling night shifts. She didn't gossip. She just carried those things the way she carried trays, balanced and steady. Behind the counter, the radio hummed an old country station, scratchy with static. Danny, her younger co-worker, danced a little as she poured juice for the girls. "You go to the craft fair this weekend?" she asked, glancing at Mara. Mara shrugged lightly, sliding a plate of over-easy eggs toward Frank. "Maybe, if I'm not too tired." "You should," Danny said, bright and insistent. "You're always working." Mara smiled, small and tired, but warm enough to end the conversation. Work kept her steady. Work and the necklace. Her fingers touched it now and then without thinking, a tiny reflex when the day pulled at her. The silver was cool against her collarbone, grounding. Out on Main Street, a black SUV glided past the diner's wide front windows, tires whispering on the pavement. Shiny, expensive, out of place among the dusty pickups and rust-bitten sedans. Mara didn't notice. She was busy wiping the counter, eyes on the next coffee pot. The quiet hour before the lunch rush was the best part of her day. A deep breath before the clang and chatter started again. She didn't know, not yet, that the necklace catching the morning sun as she leaned to pour coffee would stop someone cold, that its quiet presence would pull a thread she hadn't touched in years. For now, it was just there, as it had been since she was 19, and her grandmother slipped it over her head with a whispered, Keep this close, child. It knows where you come from. She hadn't taken it off since. Through heartbreak, through long nights balancing bills on the kitchen table, through funerals and new beginnings, it had hung there. A small thing, but enough. Enough to remind her she was made of tougher stuff than most people saw when they looked at a quiet waitress in a fading small-town diner. The grill sizzled, a bell rang, and Danny's laugh carried from the kitchen. Mara reached for a pot of fresh coffee, sunlight touching the curve of turquoise at her throat, just long enough to make it gleam before the movement of her work pulled it back into shadow. The door swung open with the kind of force that made the bell above it jangle against the frame, loud enough to pull every eye for a second. Cold air swept in behind three men in pressed suits and polished shoes that didn't know these floors. At the center walked Gregory Vance, an overcoat draped across broad shoulders, tie loosened but deliberate, the sort of casual that costs more than most people's rent. His laugh at the room first, big and careless, followed by the scent of expensive cologne that clashed with bacon grease and brewed coffee. He paused just inside the doorway, sunglasses still on though it was cloudy out, surveying the room with the instinct of someone used to owning whatever space he entered. Behind him came two younger men with phones half raised, murmuring to one another about signal strength and reception in the middle of nowhere. They looked bored and faintly amused, like tourists stopping to snap a picture of small-town life. Danny, still wiping down a booth, froze mid-swipe. Her eyes darted to Mara in silent question. Mara didn't flinch, just kept her steady pace behind the counter, towel in hand. Out here you learn not to be rattled by outsiders, especially the type who came in loud and sure of themselves. Gregory Vance took off his sunglasses and hung them from the front of his shirt, gaze sweeping until it landed on the best seat, a wide leather booth meant for four, but often taken by families or the occasional church group on Sunday. He slid in without asking. His men followed, one pulling out a sleek laptop, the other scrolling his phone. Coffee. Strong. None of that watery diner stuff. Gregory called out before anyone approached, voice pitched to fill the whole room. Mara moved toward them, pad in hand, the same way she did for every customer. She didn't let her gaze linger, didn't rush or drag her feet. Calm and practiced. "Morning," she said softly when she reached the booth. "Coffee's fresh." Gregory looked up at her, like he was measuring the space she took. "Perfect," he said, then smirked. "And maybe something edible, whatever you call breakfast here." "Eggs, bacon, hash browns," Mara replied evenly, pen poised. "Toast or biscuit?" "Biscuit," one of the younger men said, without looking up from his screen. Gregory chuckled. "Look at this, boys. Country charm. All right, bring us 3. Scrambled, extra bacon, and something green if you got it. Spinach? Avocado?" "No." He waved a dismissive hand. "Surprise me." Mara noted the order without reaction, just a small nod before stepping away. She'd heard every version of city condescension before. It slid off her like water. Still, there was a tension that moved through the diner, quiet and perceptible. Frank Daly rustled his newspaper, but didn't look up, one of the old veterans muttered under his breath, a low sound swallowed by the clink of silverware. The men's conversation carried easily across the small space. Gregory was talking real estate, new builds, flip properties, a lodge somewhere upstate. Money talk. He gestured with big, sure hands, laughing too loudly at his own jokes. When Mara returned with the coffee pot, Gregory's gaze snagged on a faint glint at her collarbone. The necklace had shifted forward as she leaned to pour. "What's that?" he asked, abrupt enough to make her glance up. She hesitated just a beat before answering. "Necklace," she said simply, finishing the pour. He barked out a laugh that wasn't cruel yet, just incredulous. "Necklace, huh? Looks like something out of a yard sale." His friends looked up now, grinning, sending the chance to echo him. "Ugly little thing, isn't it? No offense." Mara didn't look at the piece or at him. She straightened, met his eyes with a calm that didn't reach anger. "None taken," she said, and turned to refill the other mugs. Gregory smirked, apparently pleased with himself, and went back to his conversation. But the air in the diner had changed, a ripple moving through the regulars. Danny's face was tight, with a protective kind of fury. Frank lowered his newspaper just enough to watch Mara's back as she moved away. The old veterans traded glances, but said nothing. Mara returned to the counter, set down the pot, and busied herself with plates, her shoulders a little stiffer than before. She didn't touch the necklace this time, though her hand twitched once like it wanted to. Years of service work had taught her how to swallow slights whole and keep going. Still, the words had left a faint echo, sharp and cold. Gregory laughed again from his booth, oblivious or uncaring about the quiet shift around him. He didn't know the room he was in, how small towns have long memories, how quiet people sometimes hold stories you can't see. He only knew his own voice and the way it filled space. Outside, the sky thickened with clouds, light shifting to a muted gray. Inside, the smell of biscuits baking joined the coffee and bacon. Mara kept moving, steady, her face calm but her eyes darker than before. The necklace lay against her skin, silent, as if waiting. Gregory's laugh came again, sudden and jagged, a sound meant to slice through the easy quiet of the diner. He had finished half his coffee and was leaning back in the booth now, one arm stretched wide along the vinyl, claiming the space as his. The young man beside him tapped at a phone, smirking without looking up. Gregory's eyes drifted once more to the glint at Mara's throat as she set down plates of eggs and bacon with practiced care. "Seriously," he said, the word drawn out like a man tasting something bitter. "That thing, where'd you dig it up? Junk store? Yard sale? Looks like something my housekeeper would throw out." His voice was pitched just right to carry. Conversation at the veterans' table faltered mid-story. The teenage girls by the window fell quiet, forks pausing over syrup-slick pancakes. Danny froze behind the counter, towel clenched in her hand. Even the radio seemed to hush for a beat. Mara stood perfectly still, just long enough for it to register. She didn't reach for the necklace, didn't look at him, only blinked once slow, as though sorting his words into a place they couldn't reach. Gregory grinned, emboldened by the silence. "Guess everyone's got their thing, huh? Some folks buy diamonds, some folks, well..." His gaze swept the turquoise and silver like a man inspecting rust on a car. "I mean, it's kind of cute, I guess, if you're into thrift shop chic." One of his companions chuckled under his breath, quick and nervous, unsure whether to encourage or retreat. The other glanced at the room and seemed to sense the weight gathering, but said nothing. Mara slid the last plate onto their table and straightened slowly, shoulders back just enough to claim her own spine. "Coffee's hot," she said, voice steady, not soft now but measured. Then she turned away before he could answer, before his words could search for another opening. Danny's eyes tracked her all the way back behind the counter. "You okay?" she mouthed, but Mara didn't answer. She was busy pouring new coffee for Frank, who met her gaze for a brief second and then looked away. Not pity, but something protective he didn't know how to show. In the corner, old Slim Hardy shifted in his seat, boots scraping the tile. His weathered face was carved with disapproval. "City boys," he muttered, low enough for only his friends to hear. "Don't know when to shut their mouths." Gregory caught some of it and glanced over, but the old men had already turned back to their plates. He smirked and let it go, basking in his own noise. The air in the diner felt different now, thinner somehow, a current running just on the surface. It was a kind of moment small places remember, when someone crosses a line they don't even see. Mara reached for the pot of decaf, and her hand paused just slightly before wrapping around the handle. She took one quiet breath, slow enough to steady the sting gathering behind her ribs, and let it out. She had worked too many mornings like this to let one man with shiny shoes dictate the weight of her day. Still, something in her chest twisted, not shame exactly, but an old ache, the kind you learn to carry until it's part of your posture. Gregory's table erupted in another round of talk about resort properties and reviving forgotten places. They laughed, loud and careless. He didn't look her way again, satisfied maybe, or simply bored now that the target hadn't cracked. By the register, a teenage boy from the kitchen emerged with a stack of clean plates and cast a quick glance at Mara. She gave him the smallest of smiles, a signal that she was fine, that everything was normal. It wasn't quite true, but it was enough to keep the room from tipping further. She turned back to the coffee pots, swapped one for another, and kept her hands busy. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the diner's front door, and the bell above it gave a single soft jingle. Life kept moving. Eggs on the grill, forks scraping, murmured conversation trying to restart after the jolt. The necklace lay still against a collarbone, catching what little light the gray day offered. Its turquoise had dulled over the years, but the silver still held a quiet gleam. It had been meant to be worn. Her grandmother once said, not locked away. Mara touched it once, quick and small, as if reminding herself why it stayed on, no matter the commentary. At the far booth, Gregory raised his mug and signaled for a refill with a lazy wave, not looking up from his phone. Danny made a move to go, but Mara shook her head once. "I've got it," she murmured, voice calm, and crossed the room again. She poured the coffee without a word, eyes fixed on the dark stream filling his cup. Gregory didn't bother to thank her. He was already laughing about something on his screen. But others saw the veterans, Frank behind his newspaper, the teenagers who would carry the story home. They saw the way she didn't flinch, didn't snap, didn't give him the satisfaction of breaking her calm. And though no one said it, the room leaned a little her way, quiet but sure, as if silently stacking weight on her side of the scale. Mara returned to the counter, set the pot down, and went back to work. The sting still sat under her ribs, but she'd survived worse. And somewhere deep inside, something small and stubborn remained unmoved. The same thing her grandmother must have known when she pressed the necklace into her hand and said, "Keep this close." The clatter of plates and the steady hum of conversation began to return, but only in careful pieces, as if the diner were testing the air before trusting it again. Mara stood with a pot of coffee still in her hand, the weight of Gregory's words hanging there, heavy but unseen. Her face gave nothing away. Not the small crack she felt when the room fell silent. Not the ache that had slipped beneath her ribs. Just a slow inhale through her nose and the smallest shift of her shoulders, enough to look like she was adjusting the strap of her apron rather than gathering herself. Gregory was laughing again with his men, turned back toward his phone and his own stories, as if nothing had happened. It was what people like him did. Drop something sharp and then move on, leaving others to sweep the shards. He didn't look at her. The strike had already served its purpose. Mara poured the last of the coffee into his cup, steady as if she hadn't just been cut open in front of strangers. The pot clicked softly against the mug's rim. Not a drop spilled. Then she turned and walked back toward the counter. Her steps were the same length, the same measured pace, but she felt each one like she was learning to walk on new ground. She didn't hurry. Hurrying would show it mattered. Danny's eyes followed her, wide and blazing, but Mara gave the smallest shake of her head. Not here. Not now. She set the coffee pot on its warmer with quiet precision, wiped her hands on her apron once, and reached for a stack of clean mugs like she had work to do. Because she did. The diner didn't stop for feelings. Orders still needed running. Plates still needed clearing. She focused on motion. Coffee filters to change. Tickets to hang above the pass window. Frank's second refill. He always wanted it hot, not burned. The teenagers checked the print. She didn't let her eyes drift back to the booth where Gregory sat. Didn't allow herself the luxury of anger on her face. She learned a long time ago that dignity was sometimes just the art of not giving someone a scene to feed on. But the room felt different. She could sense it without looking. Frank folded his paper with a deliberate snap, not reading now, but watching quietly. One of the VFW men, Slim, shook his head and muttered to his friend. The teenage girls whispered and looked her way with something between sympathy and admiration. People noticed more than they let on. In a place like this, they always had. Mara's hands moved without her asking them to, stacking, pouring, writing. It was a way to keep her breathing even, to keep from touching the necklace where it rested cool and stubborn against her collarbone. She had sworn to herself years ago she wouldn't apologize for wearing it, wouldn't tuck it away to make other people comfortable. But the sting of being mocked still burned hot for a moment before she buried it under work. In the small window that looked into the kitchen, Cook Randy gave her a nod. Nothing big, just a quick dip of his chin before turning back to the grill. That was his version of solidarity. Danny slid over and murmured low enough so no one else would hear, "You're better than him." Mara glanced at her and offered a brief half-smile, one corner of her mouth lifting, before she went back to wiping down the counter. Somewhere in the back of her mind, a voice, her grandmother's voice, rose soft and certain. Asterisk your lane stock. We bend, but we don't break. Asterisk Mara hadn't thought about those words in years, but they came now, quiet and anchoring. She breathed a little deeper and found her balance again. The diner door swung open, and a pair of regulars came in, shaking off the cold. The bell gave its normal jingle, and something about the ordinary sound helped. Mara greeted them like she greeted everyone. Warm but not showy, voice calm and steady. She took their order pads, filled 2 glasses of water, and by the time she turned back toward the kitchen, the moment with Gregory had started to dissolve, not forgotten, but filed away where it couldn't poison the rest of her day. Behind her, Gregory was still talking loudly, but his voice no longer touched her the same way. She kept her eyes on her work, on the small things she could control, a pot of coffee that didn't overflow, a plate that didn't slip, a room she knew better than he ever would. In her quiet way, she reclaimed the space he had tried to take. And though she didn't know it, every steady, unflinching movement she made was rewriting what the room remembered, not just as mockery, but a refusal to let it land. When the lunch crowd finally thinned, the kitchen heat easing and the constant clatter settling into a softer rhythm, Mara slipped through the narrow, swinging door to the back room. It wasn't much, just a square of storage space that smelled faintly of flour, onions, and old mop water. Shelves lined with paper towel rolls and cans of tomatoes rose on either side. A dented metal desk sat against one wall, covered in receipts, and a chipped ceramic mug filled with dull pencils. It was the one place in the diner where she could stand still for a breath and not feel the weight of other people's eyes. She leaned back against the cool metal of the freezer door and closed her eyes. Only for a second, the steady hum of the compressor filled the quiet. In that moment, the adrenaline that had carried her through the morning began to drain, leaving a kind of hollow fatigue behind it. She reached up almost without thinking and let her fingertips find the chain at her throat. The necklace was cool where it slipped beneath her shirt. Silver links worn silky from decades of rubbing against skin and fabric. She drew it out into the light, holding it in her palm as though reacquainting herself with an old friend. The pendant turned slightly, catching the bare bulb above and sending back a muted gleam. Up close, the turquoise wasn't the bright jewel tone of store-bought jewelry. Its surface held deep greenish veins, small flecks of brown, stone that seemed alive, carved and set with craftsman's patience long, before mass production smoothed everything into sameness. The silver oval around was thick, a little uneven in places, with tiny markings so faint most eyes would miss them. Her thumb knew every dip and ridge. It went there now without thinking, rubbing small circles into metal until the shake in her hands settled. She could almost feel her grandmother's kitchen again. Sun coming through curtains faded to the color of old buttermilk. The slow tick of a clock on the far wall. The smell of yeast bread rising somewhere off to the side. 19 years old, scared and uncertain, Mara had sat at that kitchen table with calloused hands folded tight, and Elsie Lane had unclasped this very necklace from her own throat. "It's not fancy," Elsie had said, voice gentle but carrying a quiet force. "But it's ours. Came across oceans, then across plains. Don't sell it. Don't lose it. And when the world tries to make you small, remember where you come from." Back then, Mara hadn't really understood. She'd been caught up in her own restlessness, itching to prove she could survive alone. But the necklace stayed, stubborn as her grandmother's voice. Through job after job, long nights she'd wonder if she made a mistake staying in this town. Grief when Elsie passed and the house emptied. It had been the one thing she didn't pawn or pack away. It had weight, yes, but also a strange steadiness, like some quiet pulse that said, "You're still here." She exhaled slowly, the tension leaking out with the breath. Gregory's voice, that mocking drawl, lingered, but she let it fade. She had lived long enough to know some things weren't worth answering. People like him looked and saw nothing but surface. Their eyes slipped right over anything that didn't fit the picture they carried in their heads. That blindness wasn't hers to fix. Through the thin wall, she could hear Danny laughing lightly with one of the cooks, trying to bring the room back to normal. A few chairs scraped across tile as latecomers left. Life moved on, even when someone tried to bruise it. Mara slid the necklace back beneath her collar, letting it rest where it always did, just above the hollow of her chest. The weight was familiar, grounding. She straightened her apron, smoothed stray hair back from her face, and checked her reflection in the chrome of the freezer door. No sign of cracks, just her steady eyes looking back. The back door rattled a little from the wind outside. She glanced at it, then at the clock over the desk. 5 minutes had passed. Enough. Work waited. She pushed away from the freezer and stepped back toward the sound of plates and voices, her heartbeat steadier now. When she swung the kitchen door open, the smells of coffee and butter swept over her again, comforting and ordinary. She carried herself the same as before, quiet but unbent, though under the fabric of her shirt. The necklace pressed cool and certain against her skin, a small reminder that the judgment of strangers could not rewrite the story held. The kitchen smelled like yeast and soap that day, a warm, heavy scent that always meant her grandmother had been busy since dawn. Mara sat small and uncertain at the table, a chipped blue mug of tea between her hands. She had come home quiet from a long shift at the grocery store, shoes muddy, face pale from crying somewhere no one would see. The world had felt too big and too dismissive, and she hadn't planned to talk about it. But Elsie Lane seemed to know without asking. She always did. Outside, late summer pressed against the screens, cicadas singing in the thick Ohio air. Inside, everything felt slow and steady. The ticking of the old clock, the faint clink of jars cooling on the counter, the hum of an ancient refrigerator. Elsie moved with the deliberate grace of someone who had learned patience the hard way. Her silver hair was twisted up and pinned, her broad hands quick but sure as she wiped the flour dust from the wooden counter and came to sit opposite Mara. "You've been carrying something heavy," Elsie said finally, voice low, not pushing but leaving no room for denial. Mara shrugged. "Just work." Elsie studied her with clear, pale eyes. "It's not just work." Mara wanted to hold the words in, but they came out anyway, spilled by exhaustion, by the safety of this kitchen. They said I was nothing special. Said I should be grateful for a paycheck at all. That I'll probably never get out of here. Her throat tightened. They laugh when I talk about going to school. Elsie's eyes softened but did not pity. Let them laugh. It's not that easy. Mara's voice cracked small and young. It feels like maybe they're right. For a moment, there was only the hum of summer. Then Elsie reached the hollow of her throat and unhooked the chain she'd worn every day of Mara's life. The motion was slow, careful, as if unfastening memory itself. The necklace slid into her palm, silver gone soft with time, turquoise dull, but still catching light. "This has been ours longer than anyone's kept track," Elsie said, holding it out but not yet giving it. "Your great-grandmother wore it when she came west. Her mother before her, when she crossed an ocean to get here. It's not about what it costs, though I've been told it's worth something. It's about what it remembers." Mara's breath stilled. "Remembers?" Elsie nodded. "The stubborn heart. That's what we call it. This family's stubborn heart. We don't break easy. We've left places, started over, survived things you're too young to imagine. This little thing was at weddings, funerals, border crossings, births. You can feel it if you hold it long enough. It doesn't let you forget who you come from." She reached across and pressed a necklace into Mara's open palm. The silver was cool, unexpectedly heavy. "I've worn it for decades. It's your turn now." Mara looked down at it, throat tight. "I don't know if I'm strong like that." Elsie's weathered fingers closed gently over hers, curling the chain into her grip. "Strength isn't loud, child. It's not shouting back. It's staying yourself when somebody tries to tell you what you're worth. It's walking back into the world tomorrow, even after the day knocked you flat." Mara swallowed hard, eyes burning. "Why me?" "Because you'll need it." Elsie smiled then, slow and proud. "And because you already are." The kitchen went still except for the ticking clock and cicadas. Mara slipped the chain over her head. The pendant settled against her skin, cool and foreign, but right somehow. She felt a strange, quiet bloom inside. Not fierce exactly, but anchored, as if some long line of women she'd never met had placed a hand on her shoulder. Elsie patted her cheek, rough palm gentle. "Keep it close." Don't pawn it, don't hide it. When the world makes you small, remember, lane stock bends, but it don't break. Years later, in the back room of the diner or on nights alone with bills spread across the kitchen table, Mara would find herself touching that same pendant and hearing those same words. She didn't know then how many times she'd reach for it, or how one careless voice over coffee could awaken that memory and remind her exactly why she wore it still. By the time the noon sun shifted west and the diner's bell began ringing for the late lunch crowd, the quiet rupture from earlier had already begun to ripple outward. It happened the way most things did in a small place like this. Softly at first, in low voices over coffee and pie. Then with more confidence, once people felt sure they'd seen what they'd seen. Frank Daly started it. He was perched in his usual window seat, boots planted wide, newspaper folded neatly on the counter, so he could stare out at Main Street and comment on life as it passed. He'd watch the whole exchange without blinking, eyes narrowed behind smudged bifocals. After Gregory's laugh faded and Mara retreated to her quiet work, Frank muttered just loud enough for the other VFW men to hear. City men think they know everything. Slim Hardy chuckled once, low and dry, not looking up from his fried chicken plate. Ain't that the truth? One table over, two school bus drivers on their lunch break leaned closer. What happened? One whispered, still catching up. Big shot in the fancy coat, Slim said, jerking his chin toward Gregory's booth without actually turning his head. Took a swing at Mara. Necklace she wears. Called it trash. The drivers' faces hardened. One shook his head, slow and disappointed. People got no sense. That girl's been taking care of everybody's coffee for years. The conversation rolled like a quiet tide. A teenage boy who washed dishes slipped out to refill salt shakers and carried the story back to the kitchen. The cook paused mid-spatula flip to grunt his opinion. Figures. Roll up in here acting like money means manners. By the time the bell above the door jangled again and a pair of retirees came in for pie, they were greeted with nods and a murmured, "You just missed a show." No details needed. The news would find its way to them before the plates cleared. Danny moved fast behind the counter, a kind of protective energy humming under her skin. She kept half an eye on Mara, half an eye on the room. When someone whispered too loud, she'd shoot them a look that said be decent. But the talk didn't carry malice. It was something closer to town instinct. Taking measure, cataloging what had happened so no one could pretend it hadn't. Frank took another sip of his coffee and turned back to the window, but his jaw stayed tight. He'd known Mara since she was barely more than a kid helping her grandmother haul groceries. He didn't like seeing her made small, especially not in front of strangers. Near the back, a pair of church ladies pretended to fuss over their pie plates while leaning close. "Poor thing," one said softly. "She just took it." "That's strength," the other whispered back. "Better than shouting. She's got her grandma's backbone, I'd bet." Gregory, oblivious, was on his phone now, tapping and laughing, his voice too loud for the room's new hush. The two men with him looked less sure of themselves than before. One of them kept glancing at the door, as if calculating how soon they could leave without offending their boss. Out in the parking lot, a man hauling propane tanks paused to look through the window. Later, at the hardware store, he'd tell the clerk. Some slick suit tried to humiliate Mara at Ellie's today. Didn't take, though. She just kept on like he was air. And from there the story would make its rounds. To the feed store, to the barber, to anyone picking up mail at the post office. Inside, Mara stayed quiet, clearing plates, taking orders, smiling when needed. But she could feel it, the room bending just slightly back toward her. Eyes softened when they met hers. A few people left bigger tips than usual, slid extra bills under plates without a word. No grand gestures, just a subtle recalibration of a community, deciding which side of a moment it stands on. Frank finally caught her eye when she came with the pot. He lifted his mug, grunted his usual "top me off." When she poured, he said under his breath, "Don't let a fellow like that tell you anything about worth." Then he went back to his coffee before she could answer, as if embarrassed to have spoken aloud. The weight that had pressed against her ribs eased just a fraction. She didn't thank him, didn't want to make it bigger than it was. But she let the corner of her mouth twitch in the smallest of smiles as she moved on. By mid-afternoon, the whole town, it seemed, had heard some version of the encounter, each teller trimming or stretching details to fit their own rhythm. Some had Gregory towering like a movie villain. Others painted Mara as unflappable steel. The truth was simpler and harder. A cruel remark, a woman standing still and not breaking, a room remembering. And though she didn't know it yet, that quiet remembering would matter in ways she couldn't imagine when the necklace became more than a curiosity and the whole town would be watching again. She had been there most of the morning, unnoticed the way people who know how to disappear can be. The corner booth near the pie case always stayed half in shadow. The blinds tilted just enough to scatter light across the worn red vinyl. Iris Bellamy had chosen it with care when she came in before breakfast rush, easing her leather satchel to the floor and ordering tea in a voice barely above a whisper. She'd spent hours with a weathered notebook open, pen moving in slow, deliberate loops while she watched the room without appearing to. To most of the diners, she was just another traveler. Pale coat with frayed collar, dark hair pinned in a way that belonged to another decade, wide lens glasses that turned her gaze reflective. But she had the air of someone who studies quietly for a living, a patient watcher. The only thing that hinted at something different was the brooch at her lapel, a tiny enamel bird with colors worn soft by time. People looked once and moved on. When Gregory and his men arrived and broke the room's rhythm, Iris's pen still midline. She didn't flinch at the sound of his voice. Instead, her eyes sharpened. She watched the exchange with the same alert stillness of someone who catalogs more than she shows. When the rich man's laugh cut across the tables and his words landed heavy on Mara, Iris's gaze followed the small glint at the waitress's collarbone, the thing that caught her interest long before Gregory even noticed it. From the moment she'd walked in, Iris's trained eyes had found the necklace. She didn't look at it the way people look at pretty accessories. She looked like someone scanning for brushstrokes, for signatures half hidden. She'd seen the unusual marriage of silver and turquoise, the deep-set bezel work that didn't match cheap souvenir trinkets. It had tugged at some quiet thread of memory, an image from a dusty catalog, a footnote in a book she'd once translated about early 20th century American artisan jewelers. She hadn't been certain, but it had been enough to set her curiosity humming. Now, watching Mara retreat behind the counter with quiet dignity after the insult, Iris felt a prickle of something beyond professional interest. She saw the way the waitress touched a pendant when she thought no one was looking, not vanity, but grounding. That gesture was older than fashion. It was belonging. Iris closed her notebook slowly and set her pen inside, careful not to draw attention. She reached for her tea and sipped, eyes lowered but mind busy. She'd come through this town on a meandering research trip, chasing the fading traces of lost American studios that never reached museum walls. Forgotten names like Fletcher and Rohn, the ghost ateliers whose work only surfaces when someone cleaning out an attic doesn't know what they've got. She'd been at a symposium in Chicago just weeks ago where a curator sighed that none of the earliest turquoise-silver fusion pieces had survived outside private hands. And here, across a scuffed linoleum floor, hung something that whispered that very era. She stayed to the lunch rush, letting the story unfold, letting the gossip swell and fade. She watched the town defend Mara in small, unspoken ways, heavier tips, protective glances. She felt the pull of wanting to help, but checked it. An outsider has to move carefully in a place like this. When the last of the suits left, Gregory striding out first, phone glued to his ear, laughter trailing. Iris let the quiet return. Mara was at the counter restocking mugs, face smooth but tired at the edges. Danny glanced toward the corner booth and did a double take, as if noticing the stranger for the first time. Iris offered a small, polite smile and lifted a hand for the check. Mara came over with her usual calm, though she seemed faintly surprised to see anyone had lingered this long. "Need a refill?" she asked softly. "No, thank you," Iris said. Her voice was low and measured, warm but formal. Up close, her accent was hard to place, polished but softened by travel. She hesitated before adding, "The necklace you wear, may I ask where it came from?" Mara's eyes flickered with that private wall she kept. "Family," she said after a beat. "My grandmother." "It's beautiful," Iris replied gently, careful not to push. "Old, I think." Mara shrugged lightly, that guarded grace returning. Been around a while. Iris nodded, sensing the edge of privacy and respecting it. But something compelled her to go a little further. I study decorative arts, jewelry specifically. May I? She gestured loosely toward the pendant. Mara hesitated, then tugged it free from beneath her shirt just enough for Iris to glimpse the silver frame and the stone's green veins. Iris's breath hitched, not theatrical, just a quiet inhale of recognition. Her trained eye caught the hallmarking on the rim, almost invisible from across the room. Interesting, she murmured, mostly to herself. Very interesting. Mara half smiled, polite but wary. Never thought much about it. Iris lifted her gaze, thoughtful. You might want to. Some pieces carry more history than we realize. Then she said no more, just paid her check and offered a gentle nod. But as she stepped out into the sharp autumn light and adjusted her satchel strap, her mind was racing. She had photographs to check, colleagues to call. Something about that necklace tugged hard at her long-trained memory. And somewhere behind her, Mara touched the pendant once, maybe unconsciously, the way someone does when a stranger's interest stirs a quiet sense that something long overlooked may not be ordinary at all. The afternoon light slanted low across the diner's windows, turned the chrome trim soft and the air heavy with that post-lunch lull when everything seemed to exhale at once. Only a handful of tables remained occupied. The veterans finishing coffee, a pair of traveling nurses splitting pie, a single man at the far end scribbling in a ledger. Gregory and his retinue were long gone, their noise trailing out into town with them, leaving behind a hush that felt almost deliberate. Dishes clinked gently in the kitchen. Danny hummed under her breath while topping off salt and sugar shakers. Iris lingered in her corner booth, satchel resting at her feet, fingers drumming a faint pattern on her closed notebook. She had told herself to leave after finishing lunch, but something rooted her there. The necklace's brief gleam when Mara leaned down earlier still hovered in her mind like a half-remembered phrase. Years of studying obscure artisan work had trained her to catch such glimpses. The eye never really shut off. She'd tried to tamp down the urge. Small towns could be wary of strangers prying, but the longer she sat, the heavier the curiosity grew. Mara passed by with a tray of glasses, quiet as ever, moving to clear a booth by the window. Iris watched for a moment, taking the calm efficiency. The way Mara's expression stayed smooth but not cold. She seemed composed but far away, as though Parker had slipped into some place only she knew. Iris understood that kind of retreat, and maybe that understanding gave her the nerve to speak. When Mara returned to the counter to stack the glasses, Iris rose from her booth and approached slowly, careful not to startle. "Excuse me," she said, her voice gentle, a little hesitant. Mara looked up, eyebrows lifting a fraction. "Yes. I hope you don't mind me asking something personal," Iris began, hands loosely clasped in front of her. "Your necklace, the one you're wearing, have you ever had it appraised?" Mara's brows drew just slightly together, not in suspicion but mild surprise. "Appraised?" she repeated, almost amused at the idea. "Yes," Iris said softly, "by someone who studies antique jewelry." Mara glanced down at the pendant, which had slipped halfway into view again. Her thumb brushed the silver once before she seemed to realize she'd done it and pulled her hand away. "No," she said, almost with a shrug. "Never saw the point. Just my grandma's keepsake." Iris tilted her head, careful not to push, but equally careful not to let the moment pass. "Sometimes those keepers of memory hold more than we know," she said gently. "It's unusual, in a good way." Mara's gaze stayed guarded but not unfriendly. "Unusual how?" "The craftsmanship," Iris answered. She leaned a little closer, but her tone was still soft, non-threatening. "The silver work isn't mass-made. The turquoise is older. You can see it in the veining. And the setting style, it reminds me of a very particular period." Mara studied her for a beat, expression somewhere between curiosity and caution. "I wouldn't know," she said simply. "Never been one for fancy things." "I didn't mean to pry," Iris said quickly, sensing the retreat. "I'm an art historian, decorative arts, early 20th century mostly. I notice these things, it's habit. And when I saw it, something tugged at my memory. That's all." Mara let a breath out, slow but not unkind. It's okay. Just nobody's ever asked before. Iris offered a small smile. Sometimes strangers see what's been overlooked. Danny came back from the kitchen just then, eyeing the two women with curiosity. Mara, noticing, stepped back behind the counter, a subtle way to regain comfortable distance. "Appreciate the thought," she said, voice turning a little more businesslike, though still warm. "But it's just sentimental, not really about money." "Understandable," Iris said. She reached into her satchel and pulled out a card, hesitated, then slid it across the counter. "If you ever want to know more, this is me. No obligation. Just, I think it's worth looking at someday." Mara glanced at the card, but didn't pick it up right away. "Thanks," she said, neither accepting nor rejecting. For a moment, the two women stood in the soft quiet, one holding knowledge she couldn't yet prove, the other holding a life's worth of memory in a piece of silver and stone. Then the bell above the door jingled and new customers came in, a mother and two restless kids, and the spell broke. Mara tucked the card beside the register, turned to greet the newcomers with her practiced calm. Iris went back to her booth, gathered her things. She left a generous tip, enough to feel like respect rather than pity. Before she walked out, she looked once more at Mara and the faint glow of turquoise against worn fabric. There was something about the way the waitress wore it, not as decoration but as anchor, that made Iris's chest tighten. She had spent years hunting lost art across dusty markets and auction houses, but rarely had she seen a piece so plainly living its quiet life in the open. Mara, for her part, watched the stranger go with a small frown of thought she quickly smoothed away. Just Grandma's keepsake, she told herself again. But Iris's words clung faintly, like the aftertaste of strong tea, worth looking at someday. The door gave its familiar rattle as it swung open and Gregory Vance strode back in with the easy arrogance of someone returning to a stage he believed he owned. The lunch lull had coaxed the diner into a gentler hum. Low talk at a few booths, forks moving without rush, the hiss of bacon on the grill, carrying from the kitchen. But his presence pulled the sound taut again. He hadn't come alone. One of the young men from earlier trailed behind, phone in hand, scanning for bars of service as if the town might have sprouted new towers since morning. Gregory headed straight for his booth without waiting to be seated. "Forgot my damn tablet," he announced to no one in particular, though his voice rolled across the room just the same. He snatched the sleek device from a vinyl seat, then paused when he caught sight of Mara at the counter, speaking quietly with a stranger in the pale coat, Iris, though he hadn't bothered to learn her name. Something about two women leaning close seemed to trigger that reflexive, restless need to interrupt. "Look at this," he called over, grin already curling. "Secret swap meet?" His shoes clicked as he approached, tablet tucked under his arm like a prop. "What's the hot gossip?" "Another antique show coming to town." Mara stiffened, but didn't turn fully toward him. Iris straightened slowly, face politely blank. The moment between them, Iris's gentle question about appraisal, Mara's guarded shrug, hung there unfinished. Gregory's eyes dropped to the necklace as if drawn by an invisible string. The morning's cruelty had found its hook and was eager for another tug. "Ah," he said, tone slick with recognition. "Our famous fashion piece again. Tell me, has the expert here decided if it's worth more than a quarter I'd give a yard sale?" Mara said nothing. She kept one hand on the coffee pot she'd been holding, knuckles pale but steady. Iris inhaled softly, and that was all Gregory needed. Any sign of attention was fuel. He laughed, the sound bouncing off tile and chrome. "Listen, sweetheart," he said, turning the words toward Mara, but including the whole room in performance. "If that thing's worth a nickel, I'll buy this whole greasy spoon and let you run on my dime." He swept an arm to indicate the diner, the worn booths, the pie case, the bell above the door. "Hell, I'll make a franchise. You can have your name in lights." A hush settled, sharp and immediate. Forks hovered midair. The veterans at their table went very still, eyes narrowing. Danny's head snapped up from behind the counter, jaw clenched so tight a muscle jumped near her ear. Even the new mother with her restless kids paused, sensing something dangerous in the air. Mara didn't look at him. That refusal was its own quiet defiance. though it came at a cost. She could feel the flush threatening behind her ears, the heat of humiliation pushing up, but she forced it down, slow breath by slow breath. She'd spent a lifetime learning to swallow men like this hole, the ones who thought volume was power and cruelty was wit. She turned slightly, not to him but to Iris, and said simply, "Coffee?" The single word was like a stone placed carefully across a rushing stream, a step back to calm ground. Iris's eyes flicked to Gregory, cool and unimpressed, then back to Mara. "Yes, please," she said, voice crisp but gentle. Gregory smirked, clearly expecting protest or embarrassment and getting neither. "Suit yourselves," he said, waving a hand as if swatting at flies. "Just don't say I didn't offer to elevate the local economy." He turned on his heel with a flourish meant for an audience and strode out, tablet tucked under his arm, calling something about meetings into his phone before the bell clanged closed behind him. The silence left behind was thick, but alive. Conversations restarted in low, charged murmurs. Frank Daly muttered something unprintable and shook his head. Slim Hardy leaned forward, voice like gravel. "If that fella buys this place, I'll eat my own hat." A ripple of chuckles traveled through the room, breaking the tension. Danny came to Mara's side almost immediately, whispering fiercely, "Don't listen to that clown." Mara let out a breath so subtle it was almost invisible. "I'm fine," she said, and though her voice was calm, Danny caught the small tremor beneath it. Iris looked at Mara for a long moment, studying the steel it took to hold a straight back under that kind of heat. Then, softly but with certainty, she said, "Men like that measure everything wrong." Mara glanced at her, a flicker of gratitude passing across her guarded expression, before she nodded and busied herself with the coffee again. The necklace lay still against her chest, quiet but undeniable, catching a faint glimmer of the late afternoon sun as if it, too, refused to bow under cheap mockery. By the time the room's rhythm returned, the story had already started its next journey, whispered across booths, waiting to slip out the door and head down Main Street like news always did. And while Gregory drove off to whatever meeting he thought more important than decency, something else took root. The sense that his careless bet had been heard, recorded, and would not be forgotten. The clamor from Gregory's exit took a long moment to fade. It left behind a silence that wasn't empty so much as charged, the kind of room holds after something ugly has just passed through and everyone needs to breathe again. Chairs squeaked softly. A few cups clinked against saucers. Out on Main Street, the sound of his SUV's engine dwindled into nothing. Mara returned to her small orbit behind the counter. She moved slowly but with the same quiet discipline as always, refilling sugar canisters, wiping where there was no real spill to clean. It was work that steadied her. Danny hovered close enough to help if asked, but didn't push. The veterans had gone back to low conversation, though more than one set of eyes still followed Mara with a watchfulness that felt almost protective. Iris stayed seated for a while, fingers wrapped around her cooling tea. She had not missed a single beat of what just happened, though her face betrayed none of the disgust she felt. Instead, her gaze drifted once more to the necklace, the turquoise now catching a softer late-day glow from the west window. She thought about the names tucked into her notebooks, the obscure master jewelers she spent years chasing across forgotten archives and estate sales. She thought about Gregory's ugly laugh and the look that had passed across Mara's face. Quick, wounded, then shuddered. When the room had relaxed enough, Iris rose and approached the counter again, steps quiet. Mara looked up, wary at first but polite. "Sorry," Iris said softly, "to bother you again." Mara shook her head once, automatic, "You're not bothering." Iris glanced toward the pendant. "I keep thinking about what we said earlier," she murmured, "about how unusual that piece is. Would you mind if I took a photograph? Just for reference. I have a colleague in New York, a specialist in early 20th century silverwork. I'd like to ask her opinion." Mara blinked, surprised but not alarmed. "A photo? Only if you're comfortable," Iris said quickly. "No names, no location. Just the object." For a moment, Mara hesitated. She wasn't used to strangers asking for pieces of her life, especially not this one. But there was nothing predatory in Iris's face, only a careful curiosity, and something about having someone see beauty where another man saw trash felt Not healing exactly, but a small counterweight. All right, Mara said quietly. She pulled the necklace forward, letting it rest fully against her shirt. Her hand stayed steady even though her heart ticked a little faster. Iris produced a small camera from her satchel, not a shiny phone, but a slim black tool with manual dials, the kind scholars carried. She adjusted the focus, glanced up. Is this okay? Fine, Mara said. A faint click broke the air. Iris circled slightly to catch the pendant from another angle, careful to keep her distance and not intrude. Up close, the faint hallmark caught her eye again, a tiny pair of initials nearly lost in the silver's wear. She leaned in just enough to capture it, murmuring to herself, "Yes, there." She lowered the camera and exhaled softly, as though tucking away a secret. "Thank you. This helps." Mara smoothed the chain back under her shirt, protective again but no longer guarded. "You really think it might be something?" "I think it's certainly not what that man assumed," Iris said gently. "There's a style to the bezel, the way the turquoise is cut. I've seen similar in collections that never make it to market because they're considered too rare to part with." Mara looked down at the counter, half smiling but unconvinced. Grandma never said anything about it being special. "Sometimes they didn't talk about value," Iris replied. "Sometimes it was just love and survival. Those are hard to price." That landed somewhere deep. Mara's hand hovered briefly at her collarbone before dropping again. "Well, if your friend says anything, I guess it's nice to know. But I'm not looking to sell." "I understand." Iris's voice softened further. "You don't have to want to sell to want to know the story." A new customer came through the door just then, letting in a draft of crisp autumn air and breaking the quiet. Mara turned to greet them, falling back into her work. Iris tucked the camera away and slid a couple of bills under her saucer, larger than the cost of tea. Before she left, she caught Mara's eye one more time. "I'll email my colleague tonight," she said softly. "If it's all right, I'll let you know what she says." Mara gave a small nod. "Sure." Iris hesitated, then added with quiet conviction, "For what it's worth, it's beautiful. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Something flickered in Mara's eyes. Gratitude, maybe, though she masked it quickly with the same steady calm. "Thanks," she murmured. Then Iris stepped out into the fading light, the bell above the door chiming a final note as it closed behind her. She pulled her coat tighter, heart already racing with the thought of the image now stored on her camera, a glimpse of something long lost collectors. Maybe, more than that, a piece of history still living quietly around the neck of a woman who had just endured the kind of cruelty Iris despised most. Back inside, Mara stood alone at the counter for a moment, fingers brushing the necklace once more. She didn't know what, if anything, would come of a stranger's photo sent to some faraway expert. But for the first time in a long time, she felt a thin thread of curiosity about her grandmother's gift, about what it carried beyond love and memory. A thread strong enough to pierce through the day's sting, if only a little. The diner was quiet in the way it only became after the last door latch clicked and the neon "open" sign went dark. The clatter and chatter of the day had faded to the small, homely sounds of night work. Mop water sloshing in its bucket, the occasional squeak of a stool leg dragged across the tile, a faint hum from the refrigeration units. Outside, Main Street was mostly empty. A single car slid by, headlights sweeping across the windows and leaving shadows in their wake. Mara tied the garbage bag tight and hauled it toward the back door. Her arms ached in the pleasant, familiar way that came from hours of steady motion. She could almost trick herself into believing it had been an ordinary day if she kept her body moving. But the echo of Gregory's laughter still threaded through her chest, stubborn as smoke. Danny slammed the mop down harder than necessary, water rippling dark across the tile. She'd been quiet since the last customers left, but now the words burst out. That guy was a piece of work. She jabbed the mop in quick strokes, face flushed from a fury that hadn't cooled. Strutting in here like he owns the place. Talking to you like that. Mara smiled a small, tired smile, dragging the trash out into the alley where the night air smelled of cold leaves and oil from the back lot. She returned, wiping her hands on her apron. "It's fine." "It's not fine," Danny shot back, spinning the mop enough force to slap water against the baseboards. He humiliated you in front of half the town. Mara leaned against the counter, folding her arms. I'm still standing, aren't I? That's not the point, Danny said, eyes bright and wet the edges. You shouldn't have to be. For a long moment, neither spoke. The clock above the pie case ticked softly, marking seconds in the hush. Mara looked down at her hands, red from dishwater, lined with small scars from years of kitchen work, and let out a breath. People like him, they don't see folks like us. We're just background. Her voice was quiet, without bitterness but heavy with understanding. If I got mad every time, I'd never stop being mad. Danny leaned the mop against the wall and came closer, arms folded, shoulders still tight. Doesn't mean it didn't hurt. Mara hesitated, the words catching behind her teeth. She wanted to say no, to shrug like always. But something about the empty diner, and Danny's fierce young face broke the armor just enough for a crack to show. Yeah, she said finally, the word barely audible. She rubbed her palm across her chest, stopping where the necklace lay hidden under her shirt. Yeah, it hurt. Danny softened, the fight leaving her in a rush. She pulled a stool over and sat, boots squeaking. You didn't deserve that. You're the hardest working, kindest person in this whole town. Mara huffed a laugh, small and a little sad. That and a cup of coffee will get me through a day. I'm serious. I know. Mara's smile reached her eyes this time, faint but real. Thanks. They worked in silence for a while after that, a companionable rhythm returning. Dishes dried and stacked, salt shakers topped off, lights dimmed one by one. Outside, the last glow of daylight died completely, leaving the windows black and reflective. Each movement felt like closing a wound. Slow, careful, ordinary. When they were done, Danny peeled off her apron and slung it over a hook. You gonna be okay? Always am, Mara answered. It came out automatically, the phrase she'd said to herself for years. But when she looked up and met Danny's eyes, something in her expression softened. I will be. Just need a night. Danny nodded, unwilling but respectful. She hugged Mara quick and fierce, then left through the back, boots echoing in the alley before the sound disappeared. Alone, Mara locked the door and turned off the last overhead light. The diner fell into deep quiet, smelling of coffee and bleach and pie crust. She leaned against the counter for a long moment, one hand slipping to the pendant beneath her shirt. The metal was cool against her palm, familiar and solid. She closed her eyes and let herself feel the sting she'd pushed down all day, the sharp humiliation, the way it flared old memories of being dismissed, underestimated. She stayed there until her breathing steadied. Then she let go of the necklace and straightened, shoulders rolling back. There was still tomorrow to meet, bills to pay, another shift to work. The armor would go back on by morning, piece by piece. But for tonight, just for a breath, she allowed herself the private truth. It had hurt. And yet here she was, still whole. She gathered her bag, flipped the lock once more, and stepped into the cool night. The sky was deep with stars. Somewhere far off, a train moaned through the valley, low and mournful. Mara turned toward home, her boots scuffing softly on the sidewalk, the necklace warm now where it touched her skin, a small, steady heartbeat on the bruise of the day. The apartment was quiet in the way only small, lived-in places can be, an almost careful quiet, not empty but filled with the soft breath of things that belonged to her alone. Mara pushed the door open with one shoulder. A paper bag of leftovers balanced against her hip, and flicked the switch. The single lamp by the couch bloomed a pool of warm yellow light, touching chip paint, secondhand furniture, and the neat stacks of life arranged in corners. She set her bag down on the little table by the door and exhaled. The day's weight seemed to slide off her coat and hang there with it. It was a modest space, one long room broken by a narrow kitchen counter, the smell of old wood and last night's tea still faint in the air. Bills and envelopes were stacked in two careful piles on the table under the window, edges lined up with a precision born not from tidiness but control, small proof that she could keep her world from spilling over. A coffee mug held loose change and paper clips. On the far wall hung a single photograph in a dark wood frame. Her grandmother Elsie, younger than Mara remembered her, apron tied at the waist, a laugh caught mid-rise. The glass was smudged where Mara touched it, sometimes without thinking. She hung up her apron, washed her hands at the kitchen sink until the smell of the diner faded, and then stood for a long moment just looking around. This wasn't luxury, but was hers. Every chip dish and patch curtain earned shift by shift. She opened the bag from the diner and slid out a slice of leftover pie, set it on a plate, then changed her mind and left it untouched on the counter. Her stomach felt tight and restless. Instead, she drifted to the little table where the bills sat. She sank into the worn chair and flipped through them out of habit. Gas, electric, one from the clinic she'd been paying down since winter. She'd budgeted enough tips this week to cover what was due. Just enough. Always just enough. She reached for the old calculator and punched a few numbers, more to soothe herself with math than because anything had changed since yesterday. The room felt too still. She got up, walked a photo of Elsie, and traced the outline of the smiling woman's face through the glass. "You have told him off," she whispered, voice hoarse from a long day of being quiet. But she knew better. Elsie would have done just what she'd done, held her ground, stayed composed. Lane women didn't invite a fight they didn't need. She turned toward the mirror above the dresser. In the lamplight, her face looked older than she felt. Skin dry from dish soap and long hours, faint lines at the corners of her eyes from years of smiling at strangers. Her hands, resting on the dresser edge, were rough and strong, nails short and clean from constant work. She looked down at them for a while, thinking how different they were from the manicured hands that had gestured so carelessly in the diner. The necklace caught the lamp's glow when she finally pulled it free from beneath her shirt. She held out before her, letting it swing slightly, turquoise and silver winking back with quiet life. Alone, she could allow tenderness where the world couldn't see. She pressed the pendant against her palm until the edges left faint impressions in her skin. "Stubborn heart," she murmured, almost as a prayer. She sat back down, holding the necklace now like she might hold someone's hand. The flash of Gregory's grin replayed against her will. The condescension, the bet thrown like a dart. Her jaw tightened. For hours she had kept her face steady. But here, alone, she let her shoulders fold in and her breath hitch. She hated that his words had managed to reach her at all. A tear slipped free before she could stop it. She wiped it quickly, impatient with herself, but another followed. So she let them come, quiet and unremarkable, until the sting eased and left behind only a dull tiredness. She hadn't cried like this in a long time. Maybe that, too, was a kind of strength, knowing when to let pain have a small place to sit before it turned to stone inside. After a while, she rose and found an envelope at the back of the bill stack. Not a bill at all, but a letter she kept for courage. Elsie's looping script on the front, faded and shaky. She unfolded it, read a few lines she knew by heart. Asterisk, remember, little bird, you belong to no man's opinion. Keep your head up and your heart steady. Lane women survived storms by planting their feet and waiting them out. Asterisk, Mara smiled through damp eyes and folded the page carefully, sliding it back to its place. She put the necklace on again, clasp clicking softly, and tucked it under her shirt where it belonged. The weight settled warm against her skin, heavier tonight, but still comforting. She returned to the bills, stacked them in order for morning, and turned off the lamp. In the darkness, just before bed, she stood by the window, looking out at the quiet street. A single streetlight flickered near the corner. She thought about the stranger with the camera, the card left by the register. Maybe nothing would come of it. Maybe everything. But that wasn't for tonight. Tonight was only about breathing through the hurt and remembering who she came from. She touched the pendant one last time before pulling the quilt over her shoulders. Tomorrow would be another day behind the counter, another set of boots on the floor. But she would walk back in and stand there anyway, the same way Elsie would have, quiet, unbroken, carrying her stubborn heart in silver and stone. The next morning broke pale and cold, a thin fog curling low over Main Street. The town fell half asleep when Mara unlocked the diner's door and slipped inside, the bell giving its first small chime of the day. She flicked on the lights, coaxing the room awake. Chrome catching dull light, coffee pot set to percolate, the quiet smell of flour and frying oil beginning to bloom. Her body moved on habit, but her mind lagged behind. The night hadn't been restful. She'd lain awake too long, Gregory's laughter circling like a persistent mosquito. Even now, she felt a faint bruise in her chest where his words had landed. By 7, the first regulars had filtered in. Frank Daly claimed his usual window seat with a grunt. Slim and 2 other veterans shuffled to their corner table, boots squeaking on tile. A young couple traveling through town came in for eggs. Normal life carefully resumed. Mara was at the counter refilling creamers when the bell over the door rang again and Iris stepped in. She looked almost the same as yesterday, pale coat, leather satchel, wide glasses, but there was a different energy under the quiet. Her movements were brisker, though still careful. She scanned the room until she found Mara and offered a small smile that felt both excited and cautious. Mara blinked, surprised, then went still for a second before sliding the creamers aside. "Morning," she said as Iris approached. "Morning." Iris returned, breath faintly visible from the cold outside. "Do you have a minute?" Mara glanced around. The rush hadn't hit yet. Only a few tables to watch, and nodded. "Sure." Iris took a seat at the counter rather than her booth, lowering her voice. "I emailed a colleague last night. Someone who knows far more about early silver work than I do. She's at an auction house in New York." She paused, searching Mara's face. I showed her the photo. Mara's brows rose slightly, the barest flicker of surprise. "Already?" "I could not," Iris said, smiling faintly. "I hope that's all right." Mara hesitated, but then nodded. "It's fine." What did she say? Iris's hands rested lightly on her satchel, fingers tapping once before stilling. She was intrigued. More than intrigued, actually. Said it looked like the work of a law studio. "Fletcher and Roan. Does that name mean anything to you?" "No," Mara said slowly. "It wouldn't, unless you live in museums," Iris replied with a small chuckle. They were active around 1910 to 1920, 2 master craftsmen who blended indigenous turquoise techniques with European silver forms. Very few pieces survived. Most are in private collections. If it's truly theirs. She let the unfinished sentence hang, partly because she didn't want to overwhelm, partly because the numbers in her head didn't belong in the air just yet. Mara frowned slightly, protective instinct kicking in. "My grandmother never said anything about that. She just called it family." "That makes sense," Iris said gently. "Things like this pass quietly sometimes. People care more about meaning than market value." Mara's gaze dropped to the pendant under her shirt. Her hand hovered near it, unsure. "You think it's valuable?" Iris nodded slowly but with restraint. "Potentially. But more than that, rare, historically significant. My friend asked if she could see it in person, if you're ever willing." Mara shifted in her seat, clearly wary. "I don't know about strangers." "I understand." Iris's voice softened. "You've guarded it a long time. I'm not asking you to hand it over. Just, if you ever want to know its full story, there are people who can help." Mara didn't answer right away. She busied herself wiping a non-existent spot on the counter, buying time. "I don't know if I care about a story that doesn't change anything. Sometimes knowing what you carry doesn't change day to day," Iris said, "but it changes how you stand when people try to make you small." That landed. Mara's eyes flicked up briefly, sharp but softened by fatigue. "You think I need that?" "I think everyone deserves it," Iris replied quietly. Silence stretched between them. Behind them, Frank cleared his throat and muttered something about damn cold mornings, pretending not to eavesdrop. Slim poured sugar into his coffee with exaggerated focus. Finally, Mara exhaled. "I'll think about it." "That's all I ask," Iris said, and her smile was kind but careful. "And if you like, I can have my colleague call you directly, no pressure." Mara hesitated again but gave a small nod. "Maybe. Not now." "Of course." Iris signaled for tea, and Mara poured it, grateful for something normal to do with her hands. The 2 women sat in a gentle, almost conspiratorial quiet for a while, the kind of space where curiosity can exist without threat. Outside, the fog had lifted. Sunlight began to touch the window glass, setting off small glints on every metal edge in the room. Mara's necklace caught one and flashed once, faint but sure, as though acknowledging its own awakening. By the time more customers streamed in and the diner filled with voices again, the conversation was over. Iris returned to her corner booth with her tea, notebook open but ignored, while Mara moved back into the rhythm of work. Yet something under her skin felt subtly shifted. Not trust exactly, but the first tug of interest after years of ignoring the necklace's possible past. She caught herself touching the pendant once as she passed a window, a small unconscious motion, just a keepsake, she reminded herself, but the words felt thinner now, less certain. Maybe there was more, and maybe, for the first time, she wanted to know. The morning crowd had thickened into its usual slow churn of boots and quiet chatter by the time Iris came back to the counter. She'd lingered after her tea, making notes in her weathered book, but now she seemed restless, as though waiting for the right opening. When the bell over the door jingled and another wave of customers filed in, Mara was busy behind the counter refilling coffee, her expression composed but watchful. She still carried the weariness from the day before. It showed in the faint shadows beneath her eyes and the way she rubbed her thumb along the edge of an order pad when her hands were still. Iris waited until there was a lull. Frank bent behind his newspaper, Slim arguing softly with the cook about football, Danny carrying plates to a young family. Then she leaned forward, lowering her voice just enough so it would reach Mara and no farther. "I heard back from my colleague." Mara glanced up, cautious. "About the necklace?" "Yes." Iris hesitated, measuring how much to say. "She called last night late. She was startled. That doesn't happen often." "Startled?" Mara's brow furrowed. "Why?" Iris looked down at her notebook, as if searching for the exact phrase. "She thinks it might be a piece by Fletcher and Roan." Mara blinked at her, clearly lost. "Who?" "Fletcher and Roan," Iris repeated, a quiet reverence slipping into the name despite herself. "Two master jewelers who worked together around 1910 to 1915. They experimented with turquoise in a way no one else did, blending Navajo-inspired cuts with European silversmithing. They were secretive, didn't mass-produce anything. Then they disappeared. One died in the war. The other vanished into obscurity. Only a handful of their pieces are known to survive." Mara stared at her blankly, a dish towel in her hand still mid-fold. "I've never heard of them." "Most people haven't," Iris said softly. "Collectors whisper about them. Museums chase rumors of their work. Pieces that surface go for staggering sums. Not just because of the rarity, but because they're part of a nearly lost chapter of American craft." The word seemed too large for the diner's air. Mara glanced instinctively around to see if anyone was listening, but the clink and shuffle of breakfast insulated them. She looked back at Iris, suspicion flickering alongside confusion. "Why would something like that end up here? I've been wondering the same thing." Iris smiled gently. "But things travel strange roads. Families move, gifts change hands. Your grandmother might have gotten it from someone who didn't know, or maybe she did know and just didn't care about the market side. Sometimes the value isn't the point." Mara shook her head slowly, as though refusing to let the idea take root. "It's just been in my family forever." She called it our stubborn heart. "That's all. That's everything," Iris said quietly. "But it might also be history. My colleague said the bezel work, the way the turquoise is cut and set, it's distinctive. And that faint hallmark? She swears it's an early Fletcher and Roan mark." Mara touched the chain absently, pulling the pendant free to look at it in the light, as if seeing it for the first time. It looked the same as it always had, worn, beautiful to her because it was hers, not because of some forgotten maker's names. "So what does that even mean?" she asked, still skeptical. "It's worth a lot." Iris hesitated, choosing words. "Potentially, yes. But more than money, it's important. If it's truly theirs, it's the kind of thing that changes scholarship, fills gaps in collections." Mara laughed once, quiet and disbelieving. "That's wild. Grandma would have laughed, too." She wore it canning peaches. "Some of the greatest treasures have lived ordinary lives," Iris said. "That's why I love what I do. The world thinks everything valuable is behind glass somewhere, but pieces like this survive because someone loved them, not because they were protected." Mara studied her for a long moment. The part of her used to fighting to stay grounded after being dismissed wanted pushback, to shrug it off as fancy talk. But another part, the one that had quietly wondered about the necklace since childhood, felt something stir. And your friend sure? She's intrigued, Iris corrected gently. Sure enough to ask to see it herself. Sure enough that she asked me to tell you the name. Iris's face softened, seeing Mara's overwhelm. I know this is a lot. Mara looked down at the pendant, thumb tracing the stone's familiar veins. Fletcher and Roan, names she'd never once considered, suddenly tethered to something intimate and worn smooth by her own hands. She pictured Elsie laughing at the idea of collectors and auctions. She just told me to keep it close, Mara murmured. Said it was ours. It is, Iris said, no matter what anyone else calls it. Mara stayed quiet a long time, necklace still in her palm, the din of the diner around her fading to a low hum. She didn't know what to think. The idea of value felt almost irrelevant compared to decades of memories stitched into the metal. And yet, there was a flicker of pride, too, fragile but new. Maybe the world beyond this town would see what her grandmother had known without words. Finally, she tucked the necklace back beneath her shirt and let her breath out slow. I'm not promising anything, she said. I wouldn't ask you to, Iris replied. But now you know. Mara gave a small, wry smile. Now I know. And for the first time since Gregory's cruel laugh, something inside her shifted. Not enough to erase the bruise, but enough to push back against it. A quiet sense that what he mocked might carry a history deeper than his entire fortune, and that dignity sometimes waits for the truth to catch up. By late morning, the usual rhythm of town life had started to warp under the slow leak of gossip. The thing about small places is news doesn't spread in straight lines. It seeps, curling under doors and around corners, until suddenly everyone seems to know without quite knowing how. That's how it felt in the diner, as Saturday stretched toward noon. A hum different from normal chatter filled the booths, a current of quiet speculation that seemed to follow Mara wherever she moved. Frank Daly had arrived earlier than usual and was still anchored in his window seat, mug in hand, but now 3 other old-timers had joined him. They spoke low, leaning close over their coffee. Bits of words reached Mara's ears as she passed. City expert, old silver, worth something. Slim's boots tapped a thoughtful rhythm on the floorboards while he muttered, knew it weren't no junk. 2 tables over, the bus drivers from yesterday's lunch break had come back, lingering long after finishing their sandwiches. One whispered, friend of hers sent a picture up north. Fancy people are interested. The other shook his head, impressed. Good for her. About time something decent happened to that girl. Even the church ladies from yesterday were back, knitting half-finished scarves and sharing wide-eyed glances. Fletcher and what? One asked. Roan. The other corrected softly, like she'd rehearsed. The first nodded sagely, though it was clear she didn't know the name beyond today's whisper. Mara moved among them with the same steady calm she always wore, but inside she felt the pressure of eyes and ears, the weight of curiosity. She wasn't used to being the center of anything but quiet service. Now even the silence seemed to be listening to her. She caught Danny's eye once. Danny lifted her brows a way that said, "You seeing this?" Mara just shrugged and kept pouring coffee, though her pulse fluttered. The bell above the door clanged hard enough to jolt the room when Gregory Vance walked in. Conversations fractured into sudden stillness. He wore another loud suit, navy pinstripes today, and sunglasses he didn't bother to remove despite the modest October light. His 2 associates followed, laughing a little too loud as if to prove nothing here could touch them. Gregory scanned the room and smirked when he saw Mara. Well, he drawled, seems the celebrity's in demand. He sauntered to a booth as though he owned it, dropping into the vinyl seat with casual entitlement. Heard half the town's talking about that trinket of yours. The diner went quieter than a Sunday morning. Even Slim's boots stopped tapping. Mara felt every gaze land on her back, but didn't turn fully toward him. She set down a pot of coffee with deliberate calm and walked over. What can I get you? Her voice was even. Gregory grinned, leaning back. Menu's the same, huh? Thought maybe you'd rename the place. Mara's $1 Million Muffins or something. His friends chuckled obediently. I hear there's city folks sniffing around, appraisers and all that. Guess I should have bet more than a nickel. Frank cleared his throat in the corner, low and sharp, but didn't speak. Danny froze mid-wipe behind the counter, jaw clenched. A couple of regulars exchanged looks that were almost protective. Mara held his gaze just long enough to be polite, and nothing more. Coffee, she asked. Why not? Millionaire coffee, Gregory quipped, leaning forward with a grin too wide to be friendly. Maybe I should get in early before the price goes up. She poured without spilling a drop, set the cup down gently, and walked away before he could say more. The restraint in her spine was visible, not fear, but deliberate control. Gregory's grin faltered just a little at being denied an audience. His companions looked uncertain, glancing around at the unfriendly quiet pressing in from other tables. Conversations resumed, soft but pointed, once Mara had retreated behind the counter. The old-timers murmured louder now, protective pride sharpening their words. Man's got no respect. One said under his breath, she's better than him. Slim added, bet he's nervous. Rich folks hate what they can't measure. Danny sidled over to Mara, voice low and fierce. Ignore him. I am, Mara said quietly, though her hands trembled once before she steadied them on the counter edge. You shouldn't have to. No, Mara's mouth twitched, a sad half-smile. But I'm used to it. You shouldn't have to be. That simple insistence steadied something inside her. She didn't thank Danny, didn't have to. The solidarity was enough. Across the room, Gregory sipped his coffee and scanned the diner, expecting laughter or interest and finding mostly cold shoulders. A veteran at the corner table stared him down until he looked away. One of the church ladies whispered something that made her friend snort softly behind her scarf. The subtle shift was clear. Yesterday's easy stage had changed. The room no longer tilted toward his kind of power. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled past, and the door chimed with another customer, an antiques dealer from a nearby town, rumor said. He glanced briefly at Mara's necklace as she moved, respectful and curious, but not invasive. More proof that something new had entered the diner's air, bigger than gossip and harder to contain. Mara kept her head down and worked, but inside she felt a quiet, defiant hum. Whatever this day brought, she would not let Gregory write the story. Not anymore. The truth about the necklace, about her grandmother, about Worth, was stretching itself awake, and she could feel the town slowly taking her side. Gregory had been lounging in the booth for nearly 20 minutes, drinking coffee that had long since gone cold, pretending to scroll his phone while actually watching the room watch him. It was clear he didn't like the shift in temperature. Yesterday he'd been the center of the scene. Today he felt like a man sitting where the tide had gone out. The air carried whispers that didn't bend his way. People weren't laughing with him anymore. They were watching Mara, watching the quiet stranger in the pale coat, and that rankled. When Mara came by with the pot for a refill, he leaned back, stretching his arms along the seat as though to reclaim space. You know, he said loudly enough for half the diner to hear. I've been thinking. She didn't answer, just tipped the pot over his mug. Steam rose between them. About your little pendant there, he continued, nodding at the faint bulge under her shirt where the necklace lay hidden. All this talk flying around town, collectors, city folk, rare whatever it's called. Cute story, but let's be honest. He gave a grin that was meant to be charming, but came out sharp. It's probably not worth squat. Mara finished pouring and straightened, no expression on her face. Gregory reached into his jacket and pulled out a wallet thick with crisp bills. He thumbed through them deliberately, as though everyone should admire the texture of his money. Then he peeled off 5 $100 notes and set them on the table between his plate and his phone. Tell you what, he said, tapping the stack with one finger. 500 cash. Right here, right now. Better than what it's worth. Trust me, you could pay a bill or two, maybe get yourself something pretty. The diner stilled. Forks paused, voices cut short mid-sentence. Even the cook's spatula stilled against the grill for a beat. Frank Daly's newspaper lowered just enough for his eyes to peer over the rim. Danny, halfway through wiping a table, turned and stared, rag clutched in her hand. Mara looked at the money. Her face didn't change. Not anger, not surprise, just a deep, unhurried quiet. She set the pot down on the table's edge, straightened her apron, and met Gregory's eyes. "Thank you," she said softly. "But no." Gregory blinked once, thrown by how small and unshaken the words were. "No, no," she repeated, still calm. "It's not for sale." He laughed, short and sharp, glancing toward his friend for backup. They gave nervous chuckles that died quickly under the room's silence. "Come on, sweetheart. 500's generous. For something you said was just Grandma's keepsake, you'll never see a better offer." Mara's eyes didn't waver. "Then I'll never see a better offer." It was so quiet someone at the counter could hear the tick of the clock above the pie case. Frank's boots scraped softly on the floor. One of the veterans let out a single low whistle, not mocking but appreciative. Gregory shifted, still trying to grin, but losing some of the gleam. "You sure you want to gamble on gossip?" Mara gave the smallest shrug. "I'm sure." That should have ended it, but Gregory hated losing. He pushed the bills forward a few inches, as if proximity could tempt her. "Easy cash. You work hard enough. Thought you might want something easy for once." Mara's gaze flicked briefly to the bills, then back to his face. Her voice stayed gentle but gained an edge of steel. "My grandmother said some things you don't measure in money. This is one of them." Someone at the corner table murmured, "That's right." And the cook gave a small approving grunt. The room shifted, not loud, but undeniable, a collective leaning toward Mara. Gregory felt it. His smile faltered for real this time. He shoved the bills back into his wallet with a snap. "Suit yourself," he said, a shade harsher than before. "Don't say I didn't try to help." Mara picked up the coffee pot and turned away without answering. Her retreat wasn't timid. It was finished. Danny's mouth curled into the faintest smile as she watched Gregory simmer alone in his booth. Conversation resumed slowly but with a changed tone, quiet satisfaction, a release of held breath. Frank muttered something about "good spine on that girl." Slim chuckled and shook his head. The bus drivers grinned into their cups. Even the church ladies whispered fiercely to each other, knitting needles clicking like punctuation marks. Gregory stayed a few minutes longer, but his swagger drained with every passing second. When he finally stood, the scrape of the booth seemed louder than it should. He tossed a few bills onto the table, enough for the coffee, but not the show, and strode out. The bell over the door rang once, sharp and quick, then stilled. Mara came back to the counter slowly. Danny caught her eye, eyebrows high. "You okay?" "Fine," Mara said quietly. But this time the word wasn't armor. It felt closer to truth. Her shoulders eased just slightly, enough for Danny to catch it and nod. The necklace lay warm against Mara's chest, steady as her heartbeat. She hadn't needed Iris's expert friend or a dollar figure to know what mattered. But it helped, somehow, to see the whole room whole with her. To know that what Gregory had tried to buy could not be bought, not because of price, but because of memory and love, and a quiet refusal to be made small. By the next morning, the gossip had grown legs. What started as murmured talk over pie and coffee had slipped out into town square, down at the post office, and onto the small community Facebook page, where someone's niece had posted, "Something special at Ellie's Diner. Antique jewelry may be worth a fortune?" It was half rumor and half wonder, but it traveled fast. So when Mara stepped to the front door just after sunrise, flipping the sign and breathing in the first warm scent of brewing coffee, she felt the difference. It wasn't loud, but it hummed under the ordinary. The way strangers looked up just a little longer when she passed, the way conversation stopped for a beat before resuming. By mid-morning, a woman walked in whom Mara didn't recognize, but everyone else seemed to know. She was tall, with short auburn hair and a camera bag slung across one shoulder. Her coat was neat, but scuffed at the sleeves, the way reporters' clothes often are, worn from leaning into odd corners for a better shot. She introduced herself to Danny first, who pointed toward Mara with wide eyes. "That's Jane Mitchell," Danny whispered after she moved away. From the Gazette. Mara's first instinct was to retreat, but there was nowhere to hide. Jane approached with a brisk but warm smile, hand extended. "Mara Lane?" Jane Mitchell, local paper. Sorry to bother you. Mind if I have a word? Mara looked around. The room was half full. Frank and Slim were in their usual seats, and a few curious eyes were already pretending not to eavesdrop. She wiped her hands on her apron and nodded slowly. All right. Jane lowered her voice, but not enough to keep it from curious ears. We're running a little human interest piece. Heard you might have something rare. An heirloom necklace? No pressure, but I'd love to ask a couple questions, maybe snap a picture. People love a good story. Mara hesitated. I'm not looking for attention. I get that, Jane said gently, but the story's out there. Better to have it told right. That gave Mara pause. She'd lived long enough to know how stories twisted once they left her hands. She didn't want gossip deciding what the necklace was, or wasn't. Slowly, she nodded. Jane smiled, professional but kind. Thanks. Just a few basics. How long it's been in your family? How you wear it every day? Nothing personal if you don't want it. Mara agreed quietly, and Jane pulled out a small notepad, asking questions in a respectful, almost protective way. Your grandmother gave it to you? You've had it how long? Any idea where she got it? Mara answered simply, skimming only the safe parts. Yes, it was Elsie's, yes. She's had it since she was little. No, she didn't know much beyond family stubborn heart. Jane jotted notes with swift, neat strokes. When Jane asked if she could take a photograph, Mara hesitated again. The idea of her face in the paper made her stomach knot. But the room's quiet encouragement, Frank's slight nod, Danny's soft, "It's okay from the counter," tipped the balance. Mara lifted the pendant into the light. Jane crouched to find a good angle, camera clicking softly. She took one of just the necklace, close and careful, and another of Mara at the counter, hands folded but shoulders strong. Jane looked up after the last shutter sound and smiled. That's lovely. People will like seeing it the way you wear it, not behind glass. Mara allowed herself a tiny, self-conscious smile. Not sure it worth a story. Trust me, Jane said, tucking her camera away. Worth doesn't always mean dollars. When Jane left, the door chimed and conversation swelled at once. The veterans talked low and approving. Good she spoke up first. One of the bus drivers leaned toward another customer, already speculating about the next edition of the Gazette. The church ladies beamed like proud aunts. Danny came over, grinning. Well, look at you, tomorrow's headline. Great, Mara said dryly, though the corner of her mouth betrayed the faintest upward pull. Danny laughed. Could be worse. She'll write it right. Mara went back to work, but inside something strange was happening. She'd spent her life making herself small in the name of peace. Yet here she was, story inching out beyond her control, but maybe in a way that didn't feel like danger. Jane had asked gently, had seen her as a person before a headline. That mattered. Later, after the lunch rush, Frank tapped his cane on the tile to get her attention. Paper will run it good, he said simply. Good for you. Thanks, Mara murmured. He studied her a long moment, then added, don't let him, or anyone, make you sell if you don't want. Belongs to you first. She nodded, and for a moment the world felt slightly steadier. That evening, as she flipped the sign back to closed, Mara lingered at the counter. The day had been long, but not crushing. The necklace caught the lamplight again, a small pulse of silver and blue. Outside, someone pinned a fresh copy of the Gazette's teaser to the bulletin board by the door. Local woman's necklace sparks mystery. She almost smiled. It wasn't the kind of attention she'd asked for. But maybe, just maybe, it was the start of a story told on her own terms. One she didn't have to shrink from, one she could stand inside without apology. The phone rang just as the lunch rush was dying down. It startled Mara enough that she almost dropped the rag she was using to wipe the counter. Calls to the diner's landline were usually simple. To-go orders, deliveries, someone asking if they'd found a lost hat. But Danny, who was refilling sugar caddies nearby, glanced at the caller ID and raised her eyebrows. New York number, she mouthed. Mara frowned, uneasy. She picked up anyway, pressing the receiver to her ear. Ellie's Diner. Hello, a crisp voice said on the other end. polite but polished in a way that didn't belong to small-town life. "May I speak with Mara Lane?" "This is Mara," she said slowly, glancing at Danny, who was now openly listening. "Ms. Lane, my name is Alexander Pratt. I'm calling from Hawthorne and Bell, an auction house in New York. I hope I'm not intruding." Mara's heartbeat kicked up without her permission. Okay." He gave a small, practiced chuckle, the kind meant to ease strangers. "I understand this is unexpected. We came across a local article this morning, the Gazette, I believe, about a turquoise and silver necklace you own." Mara froze. The Gazette had printed the piece faster than she'd imagined. A small column with Jane's photograph of her at the counter. Necklace catching light. She hadn't expected it to travel beyond town limits. "I saw the piece," Alexander continued smoothly, "and I must say, it's remarkable. The photograph suggests it could be from a lost artisan studio we've long studied, Fletcher and Roan. Would you consider letting one of our specialists examine it?" Mara's throat felt dry. She shot a look at Danny, who mouthed, "Who is it?" Mara covered a mouthpiece and whispered, "Auction house," and Danny's eyes went wide. "I don't know," Mara said finally, voice careful. "It's family. Been in the family a long time." "Of course," Alexander said gently, like someone stepping over glass. "We respect that completely. Examination doesn't obligate you to anything. We would simply like to confirm details, and if you're willing, share what we learn. Provenance, makers, the piece's journey. Knowledge can be empowering." Mara didn't answer right away. Her grandmother's voice ran through her head. "Keep it close. Don't measure everything by strangers' scales." At the same time, curiosity tugged at her, quiet but persistent. Elsie had love stories. Maybe this was just learning one more story. Alexander seemed to sense her hesitation. "I assure you, Ms. Lane, we handle heirlooms with the utmost care. Our lead jewelry historian could meet you wherever is comfortable, even your town, if that helps." "Here?" Mara asked, surprised. "We've done it before," he said easily. "If travel is inconvenient, we can come to you." That felt safer somehow, not shipping the necklace off, not stepping into an intimidating Manhattan tower. Still, her chest tightened with a mix of fear and pride. She wasn't used to people like this calling for her. "I'll think about it," she said finally. "Of course," Alexander said again, not pressing. "May I send an email with my contact information? You can decide on your own time." "That's fine. Thank you. And Ms. Lane," his voice softened, "it's a beautiful piece. However this unfolds, you've done well keeping it safe." Something in Mara's chest loosened at that, just slightly. "Thanks," she said and hung up. She stood for a moment in the quiet after the dial tone, phone still in her hand. Danny came over fast. "Well, they want to see it," Mara said, voice distant. "See it? Like experts. "Yeah, from New York. Said it could be important." Danny grinned, excitement buzzing off her. "Mara, that's huge." Mara sat down on one of the stools, almost laughing at the absurdity. "Feels like too much." "It's not too much," Danny insisted. "It's about time something good happened." Frank must have overheard because his gravelly voice came from his usual booth. "New York, huh?" He gave a slow nod, approving. "Don't let him push you. You hold the cards." "I don't even play cards," Mara muttered, but it made Slim snort and the church lady smile. For the rest of the afternoon, the phone call sat in her mind like a small, glowing ember. She didn't decide anything, wasn't ready to. But she thought of Elsie at the kitchen table, hands passing the necklace over with no talk of value, just that whispered phrase. Stubborn heart. Mara had lived a life small enough to avoid harm, but maybe it was okay if this one thing stepped into the light. Maybe the story belonged to her, but could also reach beyond. That night at home, she placed the necklace on the table and just looked at it under the lamp. The turquoise seemed deeper, the silver more intricate than she'd ever noticed. She imagined skilled hands in a long-ago workshop bending over with care. Imagined its quiet travel through unknown years to end up here, with her. For the first time, she whispered the new names out loud. Fletcher and Roan. They felt strange but good on her tongue. She didn't call Alexander back yet. But she folded the paper where his number was written and slid it beside her grandmother's letter. Two small pieces of the same story. One from the past, one maybe from the future, waiting for her to decide what came next. The next morning felt heavier than it should have. Mara woke before dawn and sat at her small kitchen table. The necklace coiled in front of her like something alive. She sipped tea that had gone cold while her thoughts ran in tight, uneasy loops. The call from New York had been polite, sure, even kind, but the words had a slick shine to them. Auction house, specialist, provenance, words that belonged to rooms she'd never stepped inside, people who could twist stories she barely understood. Her grandmother had taught her early. The world was full of talkers who'd take what you have and leave you feeling grateful they didn't take more. By the time she unlocked the diner and slipped inside, that old voice was still echoing. She set up the morning prep in silence, eyes on the coffee pot, but not seeing it. Danny noticed. "You're somewhere else," she said as she came in, hanging her jacket and reaching for her apron. Mara tried to shrug it off. Just tired. Danny wasn't convinced. "That call got you spooked, huh?" Mara didn't answer, but her shoulders said enough. Danny leaned against the counter. "What's the worst you think's gonna happen? They show up and try to snatch it off your neck." Mara's lips tugged into something like a smile, but didn't hold. People scam. They see someone small town, alone, easy mark. "Maybe," Danny said, "but not everyone's like that." They sounded professional, right? "That's what makes me nervous," Mara said quietly. Professional talk can mean professional tricks. Danny tilted her head, softening her voice. "I get it. But this is different, Mara. You got the Gazette's picture out now. It's not like you're hidden anymore. If bad folks were coming, they'd have tried already. These are the ones showing their face." Mara thought about that, still chewing on doubt, when the bell over the door rang. Frank Daly stomped in, the morning cold clinging to his coat. He took one look at Mara's drawn expression and knew something was up. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, sliding onto his usual stool. Mara tried a light tone. "New York called." "City Hall or the Yankees?" he deadpanned. "Auction house. Wants to see the necklace." Frank's eyes sharpened. "And I'm not sure I want them poking around." He stirred sugar into his coffee slowly, thoughtful. "I knew a guy once. Had an old pocket watch. Family thing. Turned out worth more than his truck and house combined. He didn't sell it, but knowing what it was helped. Kept people from taking him for a ride later. Or made him a target," Mara said. "Or made him harder to cheat," Frank countered. "Knowledge is armor, girl." She blinked at that. Armor, and something about the word landed. Still, fear was stubborn. Feels like opening the door to trouble. Frank leaned back, mug in hand. Trouble's already sniffing round. Gregory proved that. Papers out. Better you stand at the door yourself than let someone else answer for you. Mara looked down at the counter, silent. Frank sipped, patient in the way old men could be when they liked you. Danny came over and nudged her shoulder. "You're not alone, you know. If you want them to come here, we'll be here. Me, Frank. Half this town probably. Town watch over a necklace?" Mara asked, half amused. "Town watch over you," Danny said, matter of fact. "We look out for our own." Frank nodded once. "Damn right." Something in Mara's chest shifted, a warmth breaking through the fear. She wasn't used to anyone claiming her in that way. Not since Elsie. For a long time it had just been her, and long hours, quiet rooms. Now, somehow, she wasn't as alone as she thought. "I don't have to sell it," Mara said, testing the idea. "Nope," Danny said. "I just find out the truth." "Exactly." Frank set his mug down with a small thud. "And if they come here and act slick, I'll be sitting right there. Been outfoxing city men longer than you've been alive." That made Mara laugh for real, a small surprise sound that loosened the knot under her ribs. "All right," she said softly. "All right, what?" Danny pressed. "I'll maybe call them back, just to hear." Danny's grin bloomed wide and proud. "That's my girl." Frank gave a satisfied grunt and went back to his paper, but Mara caught the faint curve of his mouth behind it. For the rest of the morning, the decision sat quietly inside her, not loud or flashy, but steady. She hadn't promised anything beyond a call, but it was enough. Enough to push back at fear, enough to choose curiosity over retreat. Each cup of coffee she poured felt a little lighter, each step behind the counter less burdened. Later, when a lull came, she slipped the auction house's number from her apron pocket and ran her thumb over the ink. She didn't dial yet, not ready, but she didn't show it away either. She tucked it next to her grandmother's letter in the back of the register drawer, a safe place until she decided. Frank caught the motion out of the corner of his eye and nodded once, approving but saying nothing. Danny, busy with plates, winked. Mara felt something small and fierce rise in her chest. She might not trust easily, but she wasn't powerless either. She could stand in her own doorway and choose who to let in. And maybe, for the first time in a long while, she wanted to know what waited beyond it. The bell over the diner door crashed open just before noon, louder than the usual polite jangle, and the room tensed an instant. Gregory Vance filled the doorway like a storm rolling back in, expensive coat swinging, sunglasses still on despite the gray light outside. Behind him trailed one of the younger men from before, looking less certain his boss, but unwilling to break rank. The hum of talk and clink of silverware faltered, then drained into a hush as eyes turned. Mara felt the air shift before she even looked up. She was at the coffee machine, steadying her hands around a stack of mugs. Danny froze mid-step near the counter, shoulders squaring. Frank glanced over the rim of his newspaper and then deliberately set it down, slow and deliberate. Gregory's grin was sharp and too bright for the muted room. "Well," he said, voice carrying like a man used to holding court. "Place sure got busy for a little backwater diner. Must be the treasure hunt drawing folks in." Nobody answered. That seemed to irritate him more. He strode toward the same booth he'd claimed before, dropping into the vinyl seat with a casual sprawl that looked practiced. The younger man followed awkwardly, but his eyes kept flicking to the silent regulars, watching them. Mara turned, calm mask in place, and approached with the coffee pot. "Coffee?" she asked, voice flat. Gregory took off his sunglasses at last, tossing them onto the table. "Why not? Pour some of that small-town fame." He smirked up at her. "So, heard you're making headlines now. Big shot papers, experts calling, all that jazz." Mara said nothing, poured his coffee, and turned to leave, but his voice chased her back. "You know," he said louder, enough for half the diner to hear, "folks get taken for rides all the time. These so-called experts sniff out a story, promise gold, and leave with nothing but your time and dignity. You think New York people care about you? They smell a payday, sweetheart." A low, unhappy rumble moved through the room. Boots shifting, chairs scraping lightly. Slim muttered something sharp under his breath. One of the church ladies shot Gregory a glare over her knitting needles. Danny set down her tray and stepped closer to the counter, not saying a word but radiating warning. Mara felt heat crawl up her neck, but forced her voice to stay even. "Thank you for your concern," she said quietly. Gregory laughed, leaning back. "Concern? I'm trying to save you from looking like a fool when this fairy tale collapses. Fletcher whatever? Lost jewelers? Please." They saw one grainy photo and smelled a headline. "People will say anything to get you to hand over your trinket. That trinket's worth more than your manners," Frank said suddenly, voice cutting across the room like gravel and steel. He didn't raise his head, just spoke into his mug, but it landed with the weight of decades. Gregory's head snapped toward him. "Excuse me." Frank finally looked up, eyes sharp as nails. "You heard me. Maybe let her handle her own business." A few quiet chuckles rippled from the veteran's table. Danny's mouth twitched into a smile she tried to hide. Gregory's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being challenged here. He shifted his gaze back to Mara, trying to recapture control. "Look, I'm just saying you're out of your depth. Best take the cash while you can." "No one asked you," Danny said suddenly, voice cutting clean and sure. She moved closer, arms crossed, eyes fierce. "She's not selling to you. She's not selling, period." The room came alive then, not loud but solid, the collective lean of a community, closing ranks. Slim tipped his cap low, but his eyes never left Gregory. The church lady's needles clicked sharper. Even the young bus driver who'd stopped in for lunch looked up and said quietly, "Leave her alone, man." Gregory glanced around. Startled at how alone he looked for the first time. The easy smirk faltered. He tried to cover it with a shrug, but it was thin. "Fine," he said, pushing back his cup untouched. "Suit yourselves. Don't cry when you get burned." Mara stayed still, hands at her sides, breath steady. "I'll manage," she said softly. Something in her voice made Gregory hesitate. It wasn't bravado, just calm certainty. He opened his mouth, closed it again, and finally stood with a scoff that sounded more defensive than amused. "Place is getting too big for itself anyway," he muttered, throwing a few crumpled bills on the table before striding out. The door's bell clanged sharp and then fell silent behind him. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Slim barked a laugh, rough and triumphant. "City men think they can just walk in and teach us all a lesson," he said, shaking his head. Frank grunted something that sounded like agreement. Danny came over to Mara, voice soft now. "You okay?" Mara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Yeah," she said. This time it felt true. "Yeah, I'm okay." "Good," Danny said, "because that was beautiful." Mara managed a small smile and shook her head, busying herself with cups to hide the flush in her cheeks. But inside, something different thrummed. Not the old fear, not even the new curiosity, but a steadier current. She had faced him, and the room had stood with her. That mattered more than she'd expected. She touched the necklace once, brief and private, before tucking it back beneath her shirt. Stubborn heart, her grandmother had said. Today she felt it, not just in the silver and turquoise, but in herself, in a quiet defiance that refused to be bought or bullied. The fear hadn't vanished, but it had a counterweight now. The weight of her own standing, and the knowledge she wasn't standing alone. The next week began with a strange current running through town, a buzz under ordinary routines, as if everyone was waiting for something to happen and pretending not to. By Thursday morning, Mara had stopped glancing at the phone every 5 minutes. She'd called Alexander back, her voice trembling but firm, and said they could come if they wanted, but it had to be here, at the diner. No shipping, no backroom deals. He'd agreed without hesitation. Said his team could drive up and be respectful of her space. She'd hung up shaking and then gone straight back to pouring coffee, like nothing had changed. When the morning came, the diner filled earlier than usual. Frank Daly was in his window seat at 6:30, a full hour before he usually bothered. Slim followed soon after. 2 of the bus drivers came in wearing pressed shirts, like it might matter. The church ladies arrived with knitting bags and an air of purposeful loitering. Even Danny seemed keyed up, moving faster than usual, eyes darting to the door each time the bell jangled. Mara kept her head down, but inside her stomach fluttered like a trapped bird. She had worn her plainest clothes, just a clean blouse and jeans, but the necklace sat visible against the fabric instead of tucked away. If the day was going to happen, she wouldn't hide. She thought of Elsie and that kitchen table, the quiet hands passing history without ceremony, and felt a steadiness she hadn't expected. It was just after 9 when the door opened and 2 strangers stepped in. Conversation thinned to a hush, the kind that isn't rude but deeply curious. The newcomers looked exactly like people out of another world. Dark tailored suits, polished shoes dulled by a bit of road dust, leather cases in hand. One was a tall man with gray streaks in his hair and a precise way of moving. The other, a woman with short black hair and glasses, calm and sharp-eyed. They paused just inside the door, letting the room see them before they approached the counter. Mara straightened. Danny materialized at her side, as if by accident, but really just to stand there. The man spoke first, voice even and warm but measured. "Ms. Lane." "Yes, I'm Charles Hart, senior appraiser with Hawthorne and Bell. This is Dr. Evelyn Cho, jewelry historian." He offered a hand. She shook it, palm dry despite her nerves. "Thank you for letting us visit." "Welcome," Mara said simply, and some of the tremor in her chest eased. They were human, serious but not predatory. Charles glanced around the diner, taking in its quiet audience. "I understand this is your workplace. Would you prefer somewhere private?" Mara looked at the room. Frank's watchful stare, the church ladies pretending to knit but listening hard, Danny's solid presence at her shoulder. Private men alone. She shook her head. Here's fine. Something flickered across Charles's face. Respect, maybe. He nodded. Evelyn gave a small, approving smile. Mara unfastened the necklace carefully, fingers steady though her heart thumped. She laid it on the counter's clean surface. The turquoise caught the light and seemed to deepen. The silver edges looked older and finer under the bright morning sun. The two appraisers moved closer with quiet reverence. Evelyn slipped on slim white gloves. Charles unlatched a small leather kit and set out a loop and tiny penlight. The room leaned forward without meaning to. Every clink of cutlery paused. Frank actually held his breath. Someone whispered a prayer under their breath. No one laughed. Evelyn bent close first, her loop a small glass eye scanning the metal. She turned the pendant carefully, light glancing off the bezel and stone. Charles followed, murmuring observations too soft to catch. Hand-wrought bezel, patina consistent, cuts asymmetric but deliberate. They moved with a kind of choreography, patient, precise, as if handling something alive. After several minutes, Charles straightened and looked at Mara, his face controlled but carrying a hint of wonder. "It's extraordinary," he said quietly enough for her, but loud enough for the room to catch. Early 20th century for certain. The hallmark. He angled the pendant slightly so Evelyn's penlight glinted on the faint initials. That's their mark. Fletcher and Roan. No doubt. The church lady stopped knitting at once. Slim's boots gave one slow stomp like punctuation. Danny let out a low whistle before remembering herself and clamping her mouth shut. Mara's eyes dropped to the necklace, her own breath catching. All the whispers, the guesses. Here was the first firm voice naming it real. Evelyn looked up and spoke with calm gravity. Pieces like this don't surface often. The setting is untouched, original stone, no later alterations. It's not just rare, it's museum grade. The words hung heavy and strange in the warm air. Mara felt a rush of heat in her chest. Not joy, not fear, something deeper. "My grandmother never said anything," she murmured. "She may not have known," Evelyn said gently. "Or she may have cared more about keeping it close than about labels." Charles added, "Whatever its market worth, and it is significant. The story matters most. It survived over a century, worn and loved. That's value no auction can set." Frank muttered a satisfied, "Told you," into his coffee. A ripple of low approval ran through the diner. Mara swallowed, still stunned. "So what happens now?" Charles smiled faintly. "Nothing you don't want. We can document it for you, provide provenance papers, so you know exactly what you have. If you ever wish to insure it, donate it, loan it, you'll have proof. But it's yours. Entirely." Relief swelled, so hard her knees nearly softened. She nodded slowly. "I want to keep it." "Then keep it," Evelyn said. "Just know what you're keeping." Mara let out a breath that felt like weeks leaving her chest. Around her the diner seemed to exhale, too, conversation starting up softly, proud and protective. Danny touched her elbow, whispering, "Told you. Real." Mara smiled a little, eyes bright but steady. She fastened the necklace back around her neck, the silver cool and reassuring. For the first time, she didn't just feel like a waitress holding a family keepsake. She felt like the keeper of a story long buried and still alive. And as the appraisers packed their careful tools and the room eased back into its hum, she stood a little taller behind the counter, the stubborn heart at her throat gleaming in full daylight. Charles and Evelyn worked as if the necklace were a living thing that could be startled. They laid out a narrow strip of soft white cloth across the counter, smoothing its edges until there was no crease to catch. Evelyn slipped on another pair of thin gloves, her motions practiced and almost ceremonial. The diner, usually alive with clatter and chatter, had become a quiet chapel. Forks hovered, mugs cooled in forgotten hands. Even the coffee machine seemed to hush. Mara stood close but not leaning in, her arms folded loosely, eyes pinned to the turquoise. The pendant looked different here, under the bright spill of daylight and the focus beam of Evelyn's penlight. Its blue-green depth seemed alive, not polished perfection, but breathing with veins and flecks that looked like rivers crossing desert stone. The silver frame that cradled it caught light in unexpected places. flashing once, then going dull again, as if trying to stay humble. "Look at this bezel," Evelyn murmured, voice low but reverent. Hand cut, not pressed. Each tooth individually filed to hold the stone. She shifted the loop closer, tilting the pendant a degree. "And see this line? A slight asymmetry, deliberate. It's part of their aesthetic." Fletcher and Roan rejected industrial symmetry. Charles grunted quiet agreement, peering through his own magnifier. Filigree works remarkable. No solder joints visible from the front, all tucked beneath. Whoever did this had extraordinary control. Across the room, Slim let out a slow, appreciative whistle that he tried to disguise as a cough. Frank's eyes gleamed behind his glasses. Evelyn moved to the back of the pendant, turning it with careful fingertips. "Here," she said, angling it so Mara could see. "Tiny maker's mark, F&R, but in an older form. Pre-1915, I guess. The right serif on the R curls inward. That died out after Roan's death." Mara squinted. It was almost too faint for her eyes, a ghost of initials worn down by decades of skin and time. She felt a strange shiver seeing it, proof that there was a whole lineage folded into what she thought was just family talisman. Charles glanced up. "Do you see that, Ms. Lane?" Very few people would have recognized it. Even experts sometimes miss it without magnification. She nodded, throat tight. I didn't know it was there." "Most wouldn't," Evelyn said kindly. "Your grandmother probably didn't either, but she knew to keep it safe." They continued murmuring to each other, a language of craft and rarity that felt at once foreign and grounding. Patina, closed mind, hand-drawn wire, natural matrix turquoise. Evelyn paused over stone itself, shining her light along its surface. "Bisbee blue," she said softly, from the lavender pit, long closed. These hues, robin's egg fading to deeper green at the edges, no longer possible to source. Mara's breath caught. She looked at the turquoise differently, suddenly aware of a vanished world bound up inside it. Earth long closed, hands long gone. "Weight's perfect," Charles added, balancing it lightly. "Not cast bulk, hammered sheet silver. The chain links are older too, probably original." Evelyn smiled faintly. "Someone wore this with care. The edges are softened just enough from use, not neglect but life." That line hit Mara hard. Her grandmother's hands flashed through memory, wiping flour on her apron, lifting Mara to the counter to measure sugar, fingers brushing the pendant absent-mindedly. It had lived a life. "Yes, but a loved one. You said it's valuable." Mara managed quietly. "What does that mean?" Charles looked at her, thoughtful. "If you were to sell, which I'm not saying you should, collectors would compete fiercely. It's a lost masterwork. Price would climb easily into six figures, maybe more with the right provenance." His voice was gentle but precise. "But value isn't only price. This is heritage, museum-level craft, but also family." Evelyn nodded. "Keeping it isn't losing, it's preserving." Mara blinked rapidly, caught between shock and a slow, swelling pride. She reached out, hesitant, asking permission with her eyes. Evelyn smiled and stepped back so she could lift the pendant herself. When Mara held it, it felt heavier than ever but not threatening. It was the weight of history settling into her palm. She turned it over, thumb grazing the faint initials, then looked up at them. "My grandma just said it was our stubborn heart." Evelyn's eyes softened. She was right. The room, which had been holding itself taut, seemed to release in one shared breath. People shifted, smiled quietly, some with misty eyes they pretended were from the steam of coffee. Frank muttered a proud, "Told you so," though to no one in particular. Danny sniffed once and pretended it was allergies. Mara swallowed the lump in her throat and slid the necklace back over her head, the chain cool against her neck, the pendant resting just where it always had. But now it felt claimed in a different way. She wasn't wearing just memory. She was wearing story, craft, the stubborn heart of her family, and of artisans long gone. Charles and Evelyn began packing their tools with respectful slowness, still speaking softly. Next steps, documentation. Insurance if she wanted it. Mara only half listened. Her world felt fuller, louder inside her chest. The fear that strangers might take something had been replaced by something calmer. She knew what she held now. Knowledge, Frank had said, is armor. When the appraisers finally left a quiet applause, subtle but real, Mara stood behind the counter and touched the necklace once more. She thought of Elsie's kitchen, of years spent believing this was just sentimental weight. It was more, and somehow that didn't distance her grandmother's gift. It deepened it. Around her, the diner slowly returned to life, but there was a new undercurrent. Respect, wonder, quiet pride. Mara poured the next pot of coffee, with a steadier hand than she'd had in weeks. The pendant warm against her chest like a heartbeat she'd finally learned to listen to. When the two appraisers had finished their quiet litany of measurements and murmured terms, a stillness lingered that was not just courtesy. Charles' heart hadn't moved from his lean over the counter. He was staring at the necklace with the sort of concentration people give rare paintings. Then, as though some silent equation had just clicked into place, he drew a long breath and eased back, removing the loop from his eye. The movement caught everyone's attention. Even those pretending not to watch looked up. "You know what you have here?" he asked softly, but his voice carried anyway. The words were not dramatic. They were reverent, almost hushed. Yet in the diner's charged quiet, they landed like a bell strike. Mara froze. Her first impulse was to deflect, to shake her head, to retreat into the ordinary safety of not knowing. But the question was gentle, not prying, and she found herself answering honestly. "No," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "Not really." Charles glanced toward Evelyn, who was already smiling faintly, eyes bright behind her glasses. Then he looked back to Mara. "This is the kind of piece curators spend careers hoping to find. I've seen maybe 3 confirmed Fletcher and Roan pendants in 25 years, and none in this condition. Most disappeared into private vaults or were melted down during the Depression. Yours survived whole." Around the room, a low murmur stirred. Slim muttered something like, "Well, I'll be..." and Frank's brows lifted behind his glasses. The church ladies paused mid-row of knitting, watching like wide-eyed children. Mara blinked. "Grandma just wore it," she said, almost apologetic, glancing down at the silver and turquoise as if it might scold her for ignorance. "That's probably why it's here," Evelyn said gently. "Ordinary life is often the best hiding place. Families who loved their things didn't ship them off to be weighed and sold. They just kept them, passed them down." Charles nodded. "And because of that, you're now holding something not just beautiful but historically vital. It's not just valuable, though it's a missing piece of an artistic legacy." Mara felt the words ripple through her chest. Vital, legacy. They sounded too large, too far from the life she lived. Coffee refills, bills stacked in tidy columns, quiet days. She didn't know how to hold them, but somehow they also felt right, like shoes she'd never tried on but that fit. Danny leaned closer to her, whispering so only Mara could hear. "See? Told you it was something." Mara swallowed hard and kept her gaze on the pendant. "She never said where she got it," she murmured, almost to herself. "Just keep it close." That was wisdom enough, Charles said softly. She didn't need the names. The appraisers exchanged a look, a small, private communication between professionals stunned by discovery, but careful with the weight of it. Evelyn spoke next, voice steadier but warm. "If you want, we'll prepare full documentation. Photos, historical notes, certified authentication. That way no one can ever tell you it's worthless again." At that, something in Mara's throat tightened and her eyes stung before she could stop them. She blinked quickly and nodded. "I like that." Charles's gaze softened, understanding without pity. "Then we'll make sure you have proof. Not because price matters most, but because truth protects." Across the diner, Frank let out a satisfied grunt and returned to his coffee. Slim muttered, "No more nickel offers," making a few quiet chuckles ripple. Mara's shoulders eased just a fraction, the day's tension cracking enough to let in something like pride. Not the loud kind. Hers would never be loud. But a deep, steadying pride that felt almost like belonging. Evelyn reached across the counter slightly, not touching, but close enough that the gesture felt like solidarity. "You've been the steward of something rare for decades, without even knowing. That's no small thing." Mara managed a faint smile. She would have liked hearing that. she said softly. Grandma, I think she knew, Evelyn replied. Mara touched the necklace gently, fingertips tracing the turquoise veins. The name, Fletcher and Roan, no longer felt foreign. It felt layered onto Elsie's voice, onto flower-dusted kitchens and whispered lessons. A lost legacy had found its way to her not because of luck, but because one stubborn woman wore it every day and taught another to keep it close. The quiet stretched warm now instead of heavy. Charles began tucking his tools away again, still shaking his head slightly in awe, but leaving space for Mara to breathe in what had just happened. Evelyn scribbled notes of the paperwork, already asking what details Mara would like included, careful not to claim the story. Danny reached over and squeezed Mara's arm quickly, a flash of pride before stepping back, so the moment stayed hers. Frank tipped his mug in a small salute. Mara didn't speak. She just stood there, heart thudding in a way that felt new, not nervous this time, but anchored. For years she'd worn the necklace like a secret no one wanted. Now it was a secret finally named, and naming hadn't taken it away. It was still hers, but bigger, stronger, known. She took a slow breath, raised her chin a little, and looked around at the room. Her people, her place, all of them witnesses to something extraordinary breaking through an ordinary life. No money changed hands, no deals were struck. Only knowledge and respect settled into the air. When Charles finally said, almost himself, remarkable, the whole diner seemed to agree in one quiet, collective nod. And Mara, for the first time in a very long while, let herself feel worthy of the word. When Charles and Evelyn finished their notes, the quiet in the diner felt taut, almost brittle. The two of them stepped back from the counter, trading a glance that carried a gravity everyone could feel. Charles removed his gloves with deliberate care and folded them into his leather case. Evelyn adjusted her glasses, inhaled, and then looked at Mara with a calm steadiness that made the air hold still. We're prepared to give you a formal opinion, Charles said, his voice measured but warm. He glanced at the room, the veterans leaning in, Danny standing at Mara's shoulder, the quiet cluster of locals pretending to sip coffee but hanging on every word. Then he focused fully on her. This necklace is an early work by Fletcher and Roan, circa 1912. For a moment the words hung without landing. Then Danny let out a tiny gasp, quickly swallowed. Slim muttered something reverent and low. Even Frank's lined face shifted. No smirk, no grunt, just wide, quiet eyes. Mara felt her throat tighten. So it's real. The words sounded small, but the weight behind them wasn't. Very real, Evelyn said gently, and extraordinary. Charles hesitated before adding the next part, as if choosing how hard to let the news hit. If this piece were to be placed at auction, properly documented and presented, we would expect an estimate in the range of $3 to $5 million. The sound that followed was a collective intake of breath. Gasps, low whistles, the sudden scrape of a chair leg. The church lady stopped pretending to knit and just stared. One of the bus drivers muttered an unfiltered curse before covering his mouth. Even the air seemed to shudder with the number. Mara didn't move. She felt as though the floor had tilted beneath her, the number too big to sit comfortably in the life she knew. She opened her mouth, closed it, then whispered, "That's impossible." "It's rare," Charles said carefully, "but not impossible. Its provenance, its untouched condition, the rarity of the stone and maker, it a perfect storm of significance." Mara stared at the pendant lying in the pool of morning light. $3 to $5 million. It didn't even sound like money. It sounded like another universe. She thought of her little apartment, of counting tips to pay bills. She thought of her grandmother sitting at the kitchen table with this necklace looped casually around her neck, never imagining such a figure. "I don't want to sell it," she said suddenly, voice catching but firm. Charles's mouth softened into a small smile. "Then don't. Value doesn't mean obligation. It only means you know what you have. Insurance might be wise," Evelyn added gently, "and paperwork, but nothing changes its meaning unless you choose." Mara let out a shaky laugh, half disbelief, half defense. $3 million, and I'm just going to go back to pouring coffee? "Seems like you were doing fine before you knew," Danny said softly, eyes bright. "Now you just know." That made Mara smile. Faint, wry, but real. Guess so. Across the room, Frank cleared his throat. Price tags don't change blood, he said gruffly, then almost to himself. But it sure shuts up fools. A ripple of quiet laughter passed through the diner, easing some of the tightness. Slim slapped the table once, a soft thumb of approval. The church ladies exchanged wide-eyed looks but smiled too. Mara reached out and picked up the necklace with slow, careful fingers. It felt heavier than ever, but also somehow warmer, alive with a story that was now hers to guard with full understanding. She looped it back around her neck and fastened the clasp herself. No trembling this time. Charles and Evelyn watched her with something like respect. They had delivered news that would rattle almost anyone, but they seemed to know better than to fill the space now. This was her moment. "I'll take the papers," Mara said quietly after a long breath. "I'll keep it safe, but it's staying with me." "Good," Evelyn said, smiling softly. "That's exactly where it belongs." The conversation shifted after that, practical but gentle. They promised to send detailed documentation and photos, offered advice about insurance, answered a few tentative questions from the braver locals. The initial shock slowly settled into a different energy. Pride, awe, and a protective warmth that wrapped around Mara like quiet armor. When the appraisers finally packed up and said their goodbyes, the room didn't return to normal right away. People lingered, reluctant to break the spell. Frank tapped his cane once and said to no one in particular, "Told you worth ain't what men like Vance think." Slim grinned, shaking his head. Danny squeezed Mara's shoulder and whispered, "I hope you're letting this sink in." Mara stood behind the counter long after the door shut behind the visitors. She touched the pendant lightly, feeling the cool silver against her skin, the calm weight of inheritance and discovery layered together. The number still didn't feel real. She doubted it ever would, but something deeper did. This was more than luck or money. It was her grandmother's quiet faith, confirmed and expanded. It was survival turned into legacy. She looked around the diner, the place that had held her through humiliation, and now through wonder. It was still the same room. The smell of coffee, the scratch of boots, the gossip and laughter and sighs. And she was still Mara, still a waitress with worn hands and bills waiting at home. But under her shirt now rested proof of something unshakable. Not a price tag, not a payday, a story, hers and larger than hers, finally seen. When Danny caught her eye from across the counter and smiled, Mara found herself smiling back. Not small, not defensive, just quiet and sure. She would finish her shift. She would go home to the same little apartment. And she would do it carrying a truth that no cruelty could shrink again. Gregory Vance came back the day after the appraisers left, but the air was no longer his. It was late morning, the diner comfortably busy with its ordinary tide of locals and a few curious faces from neighboring towns who'd read the Gazette's follow-up. People sat a little straighter than usual, as though sharing a secret they were proud to keep. Mara was behind the counter, hair pulled back, sleeves rolled up. She looked tired but composed, moving with the same quiet grace she always had. But something about her posture had changed. She stood straighter, eyes clear, like a weight had shifted off her shoulders and settled somewhere steady instead of heavy. The bell of the door rang, and there he was. Dark coat, polished shoes, that confident stride he wore like a badge. But it faltered almost immediately. He paused just inside, sunglasses in hand, scanning the room that no longer bent toward him. Conversations didn't stop this time. They slowed, then changed tone. Heads turned, but not with curiosity. More like the way people look at weather that's turned strange, watchful but unimpressed. Gregory hesitated a half-beat before forcing a grin and walking to his usual booth. Slim's boots tapped once against the floorboards, slow and deliberate. Frank lowered his newspaper enough to stare straight over the top. Danny was at the coffee machine and didn't bother hiding the cool set of her shoulders as she turned. Mara approached with a coffee pot, her face calm but not guarded. "Morning," she said, voice even. Gregory opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Morning." He managed finally, but the word landed dull. He cleared his throat. "Heard you had some excitement." His eyes flicked toward the necklace, clearly visible against her plain blouse. Mara didn't answer right away. She filled his cup without spilling, set it down gently, then met his gaze. You could say that. He chuckled, but it cracked halfway out, a brittle sound. 3 to 5 million, huh? Paper said so. That's what they told me, Mara said simply. He shifted in the booth, adjusting his cufflinks like he could tighten his composure. Guess I was wrong. The words came halting, uncomfortable, like rocks in his mouth. You were. Frank said flatly from his window seat, without lowering the paper again. A few quiet chuckles rolled across the room. Not mean, but sharp enough to sting. Gregory's jaw twitched. He tried to gather his usual bluster, but it seemed to slip through his fingers. Look, I stopped. That bet I made, that was just talk. Joking. Mara tilted her head slightly. I remember. He swallowed hard, color creeping into his face. Didn't mean to, embarrass you. You did, Mara said, but gently, just a fact, not an attack. But I'm fine. Something in the way she said it, steady, unshaken, landed harder than anger would have. He looked away first, studying his untouched coffee like it might rescue him. Slim muttered low to the veteran's table, loud enough to carry. Man bet the whole greasy spoon on a nickel. They snorted softly, and even one of the bus drivers coughed to hide a laugh. Gregory flinched just slightly, shoulders curling in as if the booth had shrunk. He glanced back at Mara, searching for some kind of lifeline, but she was already turned to refill another cup down the counter. Not dismissive, but done. He tried to muster one more smile, but it failed halfway. Well, good for you, he said, quiet now, almost real. Your grandma would be proud, I guess. She would. Mara answered without looking back. That ended it. Gregory sat there for another minute, staring into his mug, then pushed it away untouched and stood. No swagger this time, no grand exit. Just a man suddenly aware of the bet echoing back at him. If that thing's worth a nickel, I'll buy this whole greasy spoon. Everyone remembered. No one had to say it. As he passed Frank's table, Frank looked up fully for the first time and gave a small, unsmiling nod. Not respect, but acknowledgement of defeat. Gregory nodded back faintly, pale now in the morning light, and left without another word. The bell clanged, then fell silent behind him. The room exhaled slowly. A few chuckles broke free, low and knowing. Slim said, Well, that's one fancy tale tucked, and Danny laughed outright, shaking her head. Mara returned to the counter, setting the coffee pot down with hands that no longer trembled. Danny leaned in, whispering, You okay? Better than okay, Mara said softly, and for the first time, she meant it without armor. Frank looked over, face breaking into the smallest of grins. Stubborn heart, he said simply. Mara touched the necklace, smiling back. Yeah, she said, voice quiet but strong. Stubborn heart. The diner slipped back into its hum, but it was a new hum, one that felt protective and proud. And for the first time since that first cruel laugh, Mara felt no trace of humiliation left, only dignity, and a strange new freedom that came from truth known and witnessed. The story had turned, and she had not had to shout to make it happen. She had only stood, steady, while time and truth did the rest. The diner looked ordinary again, at least on the outside. Morning light struck the windows, catching a soft gleam on the pie case and turning the chrome edges pale gold. Inside, though, there was a calm unlike anything Mara had known in weeks. The storm of curiosity had quieted into something warmer, a quiet agreement among neighbors that the story was finished and belonged to her now. No gawking, no sly questions, just an easy way to respect. The appraisers returned one last time to deliver the final papers, a neat folder of photographs, signatures, and provenance notes. They arrived early before the rush, stepping inside with the same unassuming care as before. Charles Hart took off his hat and nodded politely. Dr. Evelyn Cho followed, eyes kind behind her glasses. They didn't ask to sit. They waited while Mara finished pouring a cup of coffee for Frank. When she came over, apron tied, hair pulled back, she looked almost the same as she always had. But there was a difference now, subtle but unmistakable. She wasn't smaller than the moment. She met them where they stood, steady and present. Charles placed the folder on the counter, as though setting down something delicate. "Everything we discussed," he said quietly. "Documentation, appraisal, maker's records. We filed the official certificate. It's yours." Mara looked at the folder, but didn't reach for it yet. "Thank you," she said simply. Her voice was quiet but carried, enough for Frank at the window and Danny by the coffee pots to hear. "You treated it, and me, with respect. I appreciate that." Charles's mouth softened into a smile. "It was our honor." Evelyn nodded, gaze warm but professional. "You've been a remarkable steward, without ever knowing. It's rare to see a piece this untouched, this loved." Mara gave the smallest shrug, almost shy. "I just wore it. My grandma told me to keep it close." "That's enough," Evelyn said. "Sometimes care is the most expert preservation." For a moment, none of them spoke. Mara finally reached out and slid the folder toward herself. She didn't flip through it. Didn't need to. Just knowing it existed was enough. Proof in history, but on her terms. "You're sure you're keeping it?" Charles asked gently, not pressing, just confirming. "I'm sure," Mara said, meeting his eyes. There was no hesitation, no apology. He nodded once, accepting her answer with the respect of someone who understood ownership in more than legal terms. "Then it's where it should be." When they turned to go, she didn't follow them with chatter or thanks meant to fill silence. She stepped around the counter, shook each hand once, firm, measured, unafraid. "Safe travels," she said, and there was something in her gaze that was not small-town timidity but quiet command. They smiled, bowed their heads slightly, and stepped back out into the bright morning. The door swung shut, leaving behind the soft clink of cups and the hum of a griddle. Danny let out a low whistle from behind the counter. "Girl, you look like you own the place." Mara laughed softly, shaking her head. "Just said thank you." "Yeah, but it wasn't the kind of thank you that bows. It was the kind that stands up." Frank tapped his cane once. The sound crisp. "Your grandma be proud," he said, voice gruff but warm. Elsie had that same spine. Mara turned, eyes shining a little bit dry. Maybe I finally learned it. The day moved on. Regulars came and went. The Gazette sent someone to snap a last photo, but stayed respectfully brief. The townsfolk went back to their routines, though every so often someone would glance at Mara and then away, a tiny smile on their face. Proud but private. The necklace hung in its usual place, catching the light now and then. It wasn't flaunted. It didn't need to be. In the quieter stretch between lunch and dinner, Mara found herself alone at the counter for a moment. She opened the folder, leafing through just enough to see one of the photos. The pendant captured in sharp detail, the initials visible now that she knew where to look. Early Fletcher and Roan, 1912. She traced a line with her fingertip, then closed the folder and set it aside. She looked around the diner. The scuffed tile, the smell of coffee and fried onions, the window where Frank held court, the booth where Gregory had shrunk into himself. She felt, for the first time in years, fully rooted here. Not because of the dollar signs or the sudden spotlight, but because the truth had met her on her own ground. She had not chased it. She had simply stood until arrived. A couple came in and sat down at the far booth, tourists by the look of their bright jackets. They looked around, clearly hoping to see the famous necklace up close. Mara went to take their order with her usual calm, pen ready. They asked, shyly, if the story was true. She smiled just enough and said, "It's true, nothing more." Then she wrote down their order and brought them coffee, moving on without ceremony. Quiet strength doesn't need proof. That was what Elsie had known. That was what today had taught her again. Mara glanced once at the window, where light spilled across the counter, and touched the necklace briefly, not to check it but to honor it. Then she returned to work, shoulders steady, eyes clear, already reclaiming the ordinariness she had fought to keep, but now with something stronger humming beneath it, a deep certainty no one could buy or break. The first signs of celebration weren't balloons or banners. They were the small things that lived in this town's quiet language. On Saturday morning, when Mara unlocked the diner, a stack of fresh flowers sat on the stoop, wild asters and late-season zinnias bundled with twine. No note, no name. Inside, A plate of still warm muffins waited on the counter under a clean kitchen towel. Danny showed up early with a shy grin and a paper bag of fancy coffee beans she'd splurged on. "For the next pot," she said, pretending it was nothing. By mid-morning, the place felt different, charged but soft. Locals drifted in not just for breakfast, but to stand witness. Slim brought his daughter, who slid onto a stool and whispered that she wanted to see the famous necklace. Frank arrived with his newspaper, an extra one tucked under his arm. He left it at the counter for Mara. The Gazette folded open to the article that ran that morning, "Our Own Hidden Treasure, the Lane Legacy." The headline sat modest but proud above a photo of Mara, not posed but caught mid-laugh with Danny in the background. It wasn't just the regulars. Farmers who usually grabbed coffee to go lingered at booths dusty from early chores. The postmaster came by with a small tin of lemon drops for your grandma's stubborn heart. The church ladies took over the corner table, knitting needles clicking, and this time when they glanced at Mara, there was no curiosity, only a quiet protectiveness. Even Mr. Henley, who rarely spoke outside of parcel lines, stopped on his way out and said she'd be proud, before nodding and shuffling off. Mara moved through it all with her usual calm, but felt the difference in every glance and every small kindness. She didn't feel put on display. They weren't gawking. They were reclaiming something with her, closing the circle that Gregory's cruelty had torn open weeks before. Their pride wasn't for the dollar signs printed in the Gazette. It was for the way she'd stood, for the dignity they'd watched her hold onto when it would have been easier to break. Danny leaned across the counter between rushes, grinning. "You know, they're all showing up to make sure you know you're loved, right?" Mara shook her head, embarrassed but warmed. "It's just a necklace." "Maybe, but it's also a whole lot more. They saw someone try to tear you down. Now they get to build you back up." After lunch, Slim stood and tapped his cup for attention. Not loud, just enough. Conversation slowed. He looked awkward, clearing his throat, then spoke to the room. "We're not ones for fuss," he said, "but some of us figured this was worth saying." He looked at Mara. "You didn't brag, you didn't gloat. You just kept showing up, and turns out what you had was gold all along. We're proud of you." The room murmured approval, a soft rumble, not applause, but heavier somehow. Frank raised his mug. Danny wiped at her eyes like she wasn't. Mara felt her face heat, and her throat close at the same time. "Thank you," she said, voice low but steady, "for standing with me. That mattered more than anything." "Always will," Slim replied simply, and sat back down. That was it. No speeches, no ceremony. Just a single offering of solidarity, accepted and done. Later, as the diner wound down and people drifted home, Mara found a small envelope tucked near the register. Inside was a card with a photograph of the diner decades ago, black and white. Her grandmother at the door laughing with some long-gone neighbor. Someone had written, "Asterisk, your family built this place with quiet hands. We're glad the world finally noticed." Asterisk, no signature. She sat for a long minute after closing, the card in her lap, the smell of coffee and grilled onions fading into the late afternoon. It wasn't about millions of dollars. It never had been. What the town gave back was harder to measure, a restoration of place, of worth. They'd seen her ridiculed and refused to let the echo linger. They answered with muffins, flowers, a headline, a toast of coffee cups. They gave her back her belonging. When she finally locked up, she walked home slowly, past the feed store and the church steps, past the post office where someone had taped up the Gazette article for all to see. People waved quietly, not making her stop, just letting her know. At her apartment door, she paused and touched the pendant once, the silver cool against her skin. It was valuable, yes, but the day had proven something larger. That value didn't have to isolate. It could knit you closer to the place that shaped you, if you let it. She brewed a late cup of tea and sat by the window, card propped beside her. The flowers she brought home scenting the room faintly. The sky outside was soft with evening, and for the first time in weeks there was no churn of anxiety in her chest. There was only quiet strength and an odd, deep gratitude, not for wealth, but for witness. Her grandmother had taught her to keep the necklace close. Today, the town had taught her to keep her head high. She smiled a little, half to herself, half to the photograph on the card. "We're okay, Grandma," she whispered. "We're really okay." The weeks after the story broke could have turned wild if she'd let them. The phone rang more than usual. Numbers she didn't know. Emails from strangers who found the diner's website. Notes from journalists who wanted her face on their next segment. Some letters arrived, too. Pale envelopes with fancy embossed return addresses. Offers to buy the necklace. Offers to help manage her new wealth. Mara read most of them once, quietly, and slid them into a shoebox she kept under her bed. She wasn't angry, just uninterested. Her world didn't need to explode because people somewhere far away thought it should. The first thing she did was simple. She paid off every debt. Credit cards, medical bills, the lingering car payment. She wrote the checks herself at the kitchen table. Hand steady, each stroke of her pen like clearing a weight off her chest. The next was harder but sweeter. She called the bank about Elsie's farmhouse out on Larkspur Road. The place had sat empty since her grandmother passed, weathered and sagging, but she had always dreamed of bringing it back. Now she could. By early spring, a truck was parked out front with fresh lumber and paint buckets. Mara spent afternoons there on her days off. Sleeves rolled, boots muddy. She didn't hire designers or crews. Just a few local contractors she trusted and neighbors who wanted to swing a hammer. Slim dropped by one Saturday with his grown son to help rehang shutters. Danny painted trim, singing badly along to the radio. Even Frank, grumbling about his knees, came to advise on porch steps and stayed long enough to build too. It wasn't about turning the house into something glossy. Mara kept it honest. The original pine floor sanded but not bleached, Elsie's kitchen cupboard scrubbed and rehung, the old window seat rebuilt where Mara had once curled up as a child. She planted hardy perennials out front, lavender, black-eyed Susans, the kind Elsie liked. At night, when she locked up and stood on the porch breathing in sawdust and fresh paint, she felt something close to peace. The house wasn't a symbol to show anyone. It was simply home returning to life. She didn't quit the diner either. She cut back her hours, no more double shifts, but she stayed on mornings, pouring coffee and sliding plates across the counter. People asked her why sometimes. "You don't need to be here," Danny said one slow Tuesday. Mara smiled and shrugged. Need's not the point. The diner was where she belonged, where stories lingered and small kindnesses happened. She wasn't trading that for some high-rise life she didn't want. The necklace itself stayed on her neck most days. Occasionally, she tucked it under her blouse when work got messy, but otherwise it sat in its usual place, silver catching the sun to the front windows. Customers still stole glances, but no one teased or treated her differently now. If anything, there was a quiet pride, the same way they might look at an old war metal pin to a jacket. Not wealth, but worth. Some changes did ripple through. She started a small scholarship fund at the community college. Anonymous at first, but people guessed. It wasn't grand, just enough to help kids who couldn't afford books or fees. She fixed the dented sign out front of the diner herself one evening, climbing a borrowed ladder as the sun went down, not because she had to, but because she liked things sturdy. She bought Danny a new set of kitchen knives after seeing hers chipped. These weren't headlines. They were the slow, deliberate ways a life could breathe easier and still stay itself. Reporters eventually lost interest when they realized there would be no dramatic relocation, no splashy spending spree. They wanted a fairy tale ending that looked like leaving, city lights, penthouses, champagne. Mara's version didn't photograph well. Just a woman walking home down the same sidewalk, past the feed store and the post office, to a house she was making whole again. One afternoon, Frank stopped by the farmhouse while she was sanding a windowsill. He leaned on his cane and watched for a while, without speaking. Finally he said, "Looks good, real good." "Slow going," she answered, smiling a little. "Slow's honest," he said. "Don't let him rush you." She nodded, and he left it at that. People here understood her kind of wealth. Time reclaimed, debt gone, roots tended. The rest was noise. When the house was finished enough to sleep in, Mara moved back in quietly. She brought Elsie's old rocker to the porch, put the photograph of her grandmother and the worn recipe box on the kitchen counter. The first night she sat at the table, drinking tea while rain tapped on the roof, and felt a circle close. The stubborn heart had come home. Every so often she would catch herself thinking of those first cruel words, junk store trash, and it no longer hurt. It was just a moment that turned, one she survived without shouting, only by holding on. She had not let someone else's scorn tell her what her inheritance was worth. Sunday morning, she still drives into town to open the diner. She parks out back, ties her apron, checks the griddle. People greet her with nods and small smiles, and life slides forward. It hasn't become a different life. It's just freer, lighter where it used to strain. She lives in the same town, but she lives it taller. On her way out some evenings, Mara touches the necklace once, not to remind herself of the price someone named, but the woman who gave it to her and of the choice she made. To stay, to keep working, to let dignity, not dollars, set her path. The silver is warm from her skin, and that's enough. Morning light slid to the diner windows in long, pale stripes, catching on the chrome trim and the glass sugar jars until the whole counter seemed dusted with quiet gold. It was early enough that the rush hadn't started, just a soft scrape of chairs and the murmur of the first regulars. Frank was in his spot with his paper and cane. Danny hummed tunelessly as she stacked mugs, and Slim leaned back in a booth nursing coffee that was mostly an excuse to linger. The air smelled of bacon and maple syrup, the kind of smell that could anchor a person no matter how far they traveled. Mara moved easily behind the counter, her apron tied neat, hair pulled back. She looked like she always had, and yet not the same at all. Something unspoken had settled into her. Not fame, not wealth, but a steadiness that showed in the way she held herself and the way her eyes met anyone's without flinch or apology. The necklace hung visible against her simple cotton blouse, silver catching stray light, turquoise alive with deep blue-green that seemed to drink in the day. No one stared at it anymore. They didn't need to. It wasn't curiosity now. It was knowledge. The Gazette article from months back still hung crooked on the corkboard near the register, edges curling slightly. Someone had underlined the phrase stubborn heart in blue pen, probably Danny, though she never admitted it. New flowers sat in a vase at the end of the counter, zinnias and wild asters from the yard she'd planted at Elsie's farmhouse. She'd driven in before dawn to open the diner after sleeping her first night in a restored house. Paint dry, floors warm underfoot, kitchen whole again. The porch swing creaked now when the breeze moved it, and her grandmother's rocker sat where it belonged. Morning, Mara. Slim called, tipping his cap. Morning, she answered, pouring his refill. Frank peered over his glasses, eyes soft. How's the house? Good, she said, and smiled just enough. Real good. Danny came up behind her and bumped her shoulder gently, a grin breaking through. You moved back in and didn't even let us throw a party. Don't need a party, Mara said, shaking her head with a small laugh. This is enough. Danny looked around the diner, at the quiet faces that belonged here. Yeah, she said. Guess it is. A couple of out-of-towners came to the door then, pausing awkwardly before sliding onto stools. They looked around with shy curiosity, clearly hoping for a glimpse of the story they'd heard, the waitress and the $1 million necklace. Mara didn't bristle. She'd grown used to the occasional stranger. She walked over, pad in hand. Morning. What do you have? They hesitated, eyes dropping to the turquoise for just a second. Then one of them smiled, a little sheepish. Pancakes and coffee, please. Sure thing, Mara said. She wrote quickly, then poured their mugs and moved on. No speeches, no explanations, no defense. Just breakfast, just life. The bell over the door chimed again, and someone called hello. The room folded back into its usual hum. Frank rustled his paper. Danny teased Slim about something. Outside, trucks passed on the highway, and there Mara stood, in the same place where months ago she'd been humiliated, standing now with the same necklace shining softly, no longer a target, but testament. She wiped the counter slowly, glanced out the window where the day was waking, and let herself breathe it all in. Not wealth, though the world would call it that, but worth, the kind that stays. She thought of Elsie at the old farmhouse table, a flower on her hands, and the whispered charge to keep it close. She had, and it had carried her here. Someone dropped a few quarters on the counter for the jukebox, and a low, familiar tune filled the room. Mara's smile deepened. She wasn't leaving. She wasn't chasing new worlds. She'd chosen to build the one she had, stronger and freer, deck on, house safe, work hers on her terms. That was the victory. She touched the pendant once, an instinct now less about checking and more about greeting, a quiet handshake with the past. The turquoise was warm from her skin. She looked up and met the eyes of a child sitting with her mother at a booth. The girl was staring with wide wonder. Mara gave her a small nod and a smile, the kind that said it's just a necklace. But it's also a story, and stories matter. The girl grinned back. Coffee steamed. The door swung open and shut with the rhythm of small-town life, and Mara stayed behind her counter, exactly where she wanted to be. The same and entirely different. The room held her not as someone pitted or gossiped about, but as someone known. Quiet strength had taken root and grown visible. Outside, the day stretched wide and ordinary. Inside, dignity lived in the simplest things: a clean countertop, a house rebuilt, a life steady. And at the center of it all, shining softly but sure, a necklace that had once been mocked and was now simply understood.